Welcome, seekers of the dark and forgotten. Tonight we open the tombs, not of kings, but of those who dared to steal from them. In the silence of the desert, under a sky older than any god remembered, lies the story of men who dug through eternity for gold and found something far worse. This is not legend. This is history written in dust, blood, and curses. The story of the grave robbers of ancient Egypt. The desert does not forget. It only waits. Long before the world had words like archaeology or history, the sands of Thebes were already heavy with memory. Every dune, every shadowed canyon held something buried beneath it. Not just bones, but the echoes of kings who had once believed they could buy eternity. The Valley of the Kings was never silent. At night, when the wind slipped through the cliffs, it carried the sound of whispers. The villagers of Deir el-Medina, the artisans who built the pharaoh's tombs, said it was the breath of the dead drifting through the shafts and corridors that twisted like veins beneath the ground. No one dared to go there after dark, not even the jackals. But hunger is a god stronger than fear. By the 20th dynasty, Egypt's golden age had dimmed. The temples were cracked, the crops failing. The pharaoh's soldiers collected grain from empty fields. The rich still wore gold, but the poor burned their furniture for warmth. In the village, the children's bellies swelled with hunger, and the priests said it was the curse of the gods. Yet the villagers knew better. It was the curse of the pharaohs themselves, who had hoarded all wealth in their tombs while their descendants starved. And so, beneath a sickle moon, men began to gather. They were not strangers. They were masons, artisans, laborers, the same men who had once carved the king's resting places. They knew every hidden door, every false wall meant to confuse intruders. What irony, they thought, that they had built the prisons that now guarded their salvation. Their leader was a man named Rekhmire. He had been a stonemason in his youth, strong as an ox and twice as patient. He knew the sound of limestone breaking like music. But what had once been a skill of devotion had turned into a craft of survival. That night, the men stood at the edge of the valley. The moonlight shimmered over the cliffs, making them look like giant stone waves frozen in time. Rekhmire held a torch low. "We take what is already ours," he said. "We built their tombs. Let the gods punish those who starve the living." No one argued. The tomb they chose was not one of the great pharaohs, but a noble's, smaller, less guarded, but rumored to hold golden masks and vessels of lapis and carnelian. The entrance was half buried beneath centuries of sand. Rekhmire's men dug silently, their fingers bleeding, until they reached the lintel stone that read, "He who breaks this seal shall find death within his breath." The younger men hesitated, but Rekhmire laughed. "Then let the gods choke on our hunger." He drove his chisel into the stone. The sound cracked through the valley like thunder. Inside, the air was still and cold. They descended with oil lamps, the flames trembling in their hands. The walls around them were alive with color, painted scenes of the soul's journey into the afterlife. Jackal-headed Anubis guided the dead through trials. Serpents coiled around sun disks. The scales of Ma'at weighed the heart against the feather of truth. Each step deeper felt like trespassing into another world. At last, they entered the burial chamber. The sarcophagus stood at the center, massive and gleaming, its surface covered in hieroglyphics that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Around it lay piles of treasure, necklaces, amulets, gilded furniture, vases of perfumed oil long turned to dust. For a moment, no one moved. The gold reflected on their faces, and Reckmeyer saw in their eyes something beyond greed, awe. He whispered, "Take what you can carry." They worked quickly. The sound of metal against stone filled the chamber. Coins clinked into sacks. A carved idol of Hathor toppled, shattering on the floor. Then, as one man pried open a chest in the corner, a gust of cold air swept through the tomb. The lamps flickered violently. "Cover the entrance," Reckmeyer hissed. "No one must see our light." But the wind did not come from outside. It rose from the sarcophagus. The lid shuddered. Dust fell from its seams. The men froze, their faces pale. Then, with a long, low groan, the stone slab slid open on its own. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then came the smell, old, dry, like burning linen and iron. Something moved within. Reckmeyer stepped closer, torch trembling in his hand. Inside, the mummy lay wrapped in blackened linen, its hands crossed over its chest. A mask of gold still covered its face, beautiful and terrible, a smile carved into eternity. But the eyes beneath the mask were not empty. They were wet. The torch sputtered, throwing sparks across the walls. The paintings seemed to come alive, Anubis turning his head, serpents uncoiling. One man screamed, another dropped his sack and ran. Reckmeyer's torch went out. In the darkness, something whispered his name, not in human speech, but in the dry rustle of linen, the slow grind of sand. He stumbled back, tripping over treasure, until his hand found the floor slick with oil. He smelled smoke, fire. The tomb was filling with heat and sound, voices chanting, thousands of them, like the murmurs of a forgotten city awakening beneath the earth. He clawed his way up the tunnel, choking on dust. Behind him, the flames roared, fed by the spilled oil. The other men were gone, swallowed by the dark. He did not look back. When he reached the surface, dawn was breaking. The valley was silent again. The wind had covered every trace of their digging. Reckmeyer fell to his knees and coughed blood onto the sand. He never spoke of what happened in the tomb. But that morning, the priests of Thebes claimed to have heard cries beneath the cliffs. They said the gods were stirring, that the balance between life and death had been disturbed. And when the sun rose over the desert, it glinted off something half buried near the entrance of the tomb, a mask of gold, its expression frozen in laughter. By the time Reckmeyer returned to his village, his hair had gone white. That night, he dreamed of the tomb again, of hands made of ash reaching through stone, of his name carved in hieroglyphs he could not read. When he awoke, sand was scattered across his floor. His wife asked what was wrong, but he said nothing. He could not tell her that he could still hear the voices, faint, rhythmic, whispering the same phrase over and over. Gold is the flesh of the gods. Blood is the payment of thieves. He threw the last of his stolen treasure into the Nile, but it was too late. The current carried it away, glittering in the sun like a trail leading back to the valley. By the next moon, Rechmire was dead. His body was found near the cliffs, hands clenched around his throat as though strangled by invisible fingers. The wind buried him by noon. But the treasure he and his men had disturbed did not stay buried. It traveled from hand to hand, village to city, curse to curse, until the pharaoh's tombs became known not as places of rest, but as traps for the greedy. And so began the legend of Egypt's first grave robbers, men who had stolen from gods, and in doing so, awakened something older than death itself. The desert, patient as ever, covered the tomb once more. The sand whispered over stone. It had waited before. It could wait again. The Nile glistened like molten copper under the rising sun. Its current, slow and eternal, seemed to carry whispers from both the land of the living and the kingdom of the dead. Across its western bank, the cliffs of Thebes rose like the ribs of a giant buried beneath the sand, the threshold to another world. The priests said the western desert belonged to the dead. Every evening, as the sun sank beyond the river, the Egyptians believed it followed the souls into the underworld. When it rose again, it carried them, reborn, back into the light. But sometimes the sun rose weakly, its gold dimmed by shadow. And that, the people whispered, was when something in the west refused to stay buried. The valley had always drawn the living to serve the dead. Entire villages thrived on it. Masons, carpenters, and artists who painted the pharaoh's journeys through the Duat, the underworld. The most skilled of them lived in Deir el-Medina, a walled community nestled in the hills cut off from the rest of the world. There the air was heavy with both devotion and secrecy. The workers built tombs that no one was meant to see, chambers filled with spells and traps to ward off eternity's thieves. Yet the men of Deir el-Medina were human. They drank, they quarreled, they aged, and they dreamed of what glittered beneath their chisels. For decades they worked by torchlight, shaping gold and lapis lazuli into beauty meant only for the gods. The pharaoh's afterlife was secure. Theirs was not. When famine struck, the workers' pay came late or not at all. The overseers took what little grain they had, claiming it for temple taxes. The priests blamed the workers for angering the gods, but in the taverns by the Nile, men whispered that it was the gods who had grown greedy. Among them was a man named Hori, once a draftsman in the service of Pharaoh Ramses IX. His hands had drawn the maps of tomb corridors, the angles of hidden doors, the curves of sarcophagi. He had once been proud of his work, but pride could not feed his son. When word spread that a tomb had been breached in the Western Valley, one sealed for more than 400 years, fear rippled through Thebes like a fever. The priests sealed the temples, forbidding anyone from crossing the river. But Hori knew the truth behind the panic. The tomb had been opened by men like him.
He also knew where they would strike next. That night, under a crescent moon, he met 3 others by the banks of the Nile. Rechmire's story, the mason who had vanished after raiding a noble's tomb, had become a ghost tale told to frighten children, but to desperate men, ghosts were the least of their worries. The leader of this new band was a former guard named Panesi, a tall man with a soldier's scars and a priest's voice. "The priests steal from the dead every day," he said. "They call it holy work. We take one treasure, and they call us cursed. I say the curse is theirs." Hori looked out at the river. The moon's reflection rippled like a silver snake. "Which tomb?" he asked. Panesi smiled. "One of the lesser kings, Ramesses III. The guards will not go near it. They say it whispers when the wind blows." Hori's heart sank. Ramesses III, the pharaoh who had outlived his assassins, who had ordered his killers' throats cut before he died. A king who refused to die quietly. If his tomb still whispered, it was not with the wind. But Hori said nothing. He thought of his son coughing through the nights, of his wife counting the last of their grain. He thought of the pharaohs sleeping beneath mountains of gold while the living begged for bread. "When do we go?" he said. They crossed the river in silence. The water lapped against the sides of their reed boat, dark and thick as ink. The cliffs loomed ahead, pale and cold, as if carved from bone. The valley waited, vast, hollow, echoing with unseen breath. At the mouth of the tomb, Panesi raised his torch. The hieroglyphs carved into the stone door gleamed faintly, their edges dusted with salt and decay. The inscription read, "The door to the horizon of eternity. Disturb it not, lest you awaken what watches in darkness." Hori traced the carving with his fingertips. "It's sealed," he said. Panesi lifted his hammer. Not for long. The sound of breaking stone rolled through the valley. Birds fled from the cliffs. The air thickened, as though the desert itself had drawn breath. When the door gave way, the smell that emerged was dry and sweet, the scent of resin and old death. They entered single file, their torches flickering in the stale air. The walls were covered in scenes of battle and triumph, all in brilliant ochres and blues that had survived 1,000 years without fading.
But beneath the beauty lay something else. The eyes of the painted figures seemed to follow them. The gods, their faces half worn, seemed to shift when the light moved. At last they reached the burial chamber. The coffin of Ramesses III lay at the center, carved from red granite, immense and unbroken. The lid bore his likeness, eyes open, mouth smiling faintly, as if aware of what they had come to do. Panesi knelt, pressing his ear against the stone. "He sleeps well," he whispered. "Let's wake him." Hori's hand trembled. "Wait," he said. "There are markings here, not part of the original design." He brushed the dust away. Beneath the painted glyphs were scratches, fresh ones, words written by someone else long after the tomb had been sealed. The letters formed a single line. "We opened it once. The dead are still walking." Panesi laughed. "Then they'll walk with empty pockets." He raised his chisel. When the lid slid aside, the air exploded outward, thick and hot, as though the tomb itself had been breathing all this time. The torches flickered violently. Inside lay the mummy, wrapped in pitch-black linen. Its mask was gold, its chest covered in jewels. Panesi reached forward. The gods forgive nothing, but they forget everything. The mummy's hand moved. At first, Hori thought it was the flame's shadow, but then the fingers twitched again, slow and deliberate. The linen cracked as it bent. Panesi froze, his arm still outstretched. Then, as though unseen strings had been cut, he collapsed. The others screamed. Hori lifted his torch and saw that Panesi's face had gone ashen, his eyes open but empty. No wound, no blood, just death, instant and absolute. The torches dimmed, the chamber filled with sound. It was not wind, not echo, it was voices.
hundreds of them whispering in the same dry tongue. The walls seemed to breathe. The painted gods leaned closer, their mouths curving into knowing smiles. Hori dropped his torch and ran. Behind him, the chamber blazed with sudden light, not fire, but gold, radiant and living. The coffin's mask glowed as though the pharaoh himself were smiling in triumph. When Hori burst out into the night, the desert was silent again. The stars above looked colder than ever. He stumbled to the riverbank and fell to his knees, trembling. He stayed there until dawn, watching the water flow east toward the sun. By morning, only 2 of the men returned to Thebes. One went mad, muttering of whispers in the sand. The other disappeared within days, last seen walking toward the valley in daylight, laughing to himself. Hori tried to live as if nothing had happened. He burned his tools, swore to the gods he would never draw again. But at night, he could still hear the chanting. Sometimes he woke to find dust on his chest, as if a hand had pressed there while he slept. Then one evening, a boy came running through the streets, shouting that the priests had found something near the river, a statue washed ashore, gold and perfect. The townspeople gathered to see it. Hori followed the crowd, his blood running cold. The statue was of Ramesses III. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face serene, his eyes open. But around his neck hung something that had not been there before, a scrap of linen, blackened with age. Hori stared until the world tilted. The linen was marked with a single word in his own handwriting, a name he had not written in years. His son's. He fled that night, leaving Thebes behind. Some said he drowned himself in the Nile. Others said he went into the desert to beg forgiveness from the gods. But a few whispered that they had seen him wandering among the tombs, carrying a torch that never went out, calling softly for a boy who never answered. The priests said the gods had punished him. The workers said the kings had taken him. But the truth was simpler and crueler. The dead never rest when their gold is touched. And in the Valley of the Kings, the city of the dead had begun to wake. Gold is a patient animal. It lies in the dark like something sleeping with one eye open, reflecting whatever light survives the centuries. Priests call it the skin of Ra. Merchants call it the price of a man's future. Thieves call it silence with teeth. However it is named, it knows how to wait. And in Egypt's late days, when famine chewed the edges of every district and the army's rations shrank to a single crust, it waited under the western cliffs for hands desperate enough to pull it from the dead. After Panehesi collapsed in the tomb of Ramesses and Hori fled the city, the river carried stories faster than boats. In alehouses near the temple granaries, in the shade of sycamores where scribes stretched their aching backs, whispers gathered like flies. That a granite coffin breathed, that a mummy stirred, that a soldier-turned thief fell as if a god had blown out his candle with one breath. The priests countered with proclamations. The ancient curses were allegory. The gods loved order. The tombs were safe under vigilant eyes, but the villages heard only the empty echo inside the granaries when the doors swung open. Belief follows the stomach. The stomach had already decided. There is a market at Medinet Habu, where the stalls lean into each other like old men, where fishwives shout prices the wind immediately steals, where red ochre and blue frit and resinous myrrh make a sweetness that never quite drowns the Nile stink. There, a man named Camnetcher laid out amulets under a fraying canopy and watched for buyers who walked too slowly past his table. He had good eyes for fear, a hawk's eyes sharpened by ruin. He was not a robber.
He was worse. He was the broker who taught robbers to speak softly. Nebamun's tent hid a smaller tent and a clay jar of coins beneath a mat. When the sun leaned west, his nephew would lift that mat and stare until his uncle cuffed his ear. "Your eyes are gold-sick," he said. "Don't stare. Gold stares back." A clerk from the temple crossed the alley, robe mended along the hem, ink on his thumb like a bruise. He paused at Nebamun's stall and touched a faience scarab with 2 fingers, testing its coolness, as if bones remember temperature. "A royal piece," he said lightly. "Local," he replied. "Middle of the road. The sort of thing priests bless and then forget how they came by." His smile had no teeth in it. The clerk looked at the scarab again. The glaze was true, the drill marks honest, the hieroglyphs not clumsy with modern hands. Nebamun had a supplier who brought him items only the underground could provide. Ushabti figures with dirt still in the folds, finger rings that still smelled faintly of bitumen, a gold foil eye torn from a mask. "Who brings you these?" the clerk asked. "The river," he said. "The river brings everything." The clerk left. The nephew returned with a pitcher of tepid beer, which Nebamun drank as if it could outrun heat. Across the lane, a boy began to sing a harvest song no one had energy to finish. The day stretched thin and hummed like a string drawn too tight. Somewhere behind the walls of the mortuary temple, a ritual drum thudded slowly, proving to the empty air that time still had a spine.
Close to sundown, a woman in a linen veil approached the stall and did not look at the amulets at all. "My husband was a quarryman," she said, "before stone began to pay in curses. He left 2 nights ago with a group from the western village. I want to know the name of the man who buys what they bring." Nebamun folded the cloth over his wares. "Traders don't take sides, mother." "Traders are sides. Which one are you?" He might have lied. He might have shrugged. Instead, he looked at the way her hands worried the edge of the veil and saw the truth that keeps markets alive. She was not afraid of the tombs. She was afraid of what he would say about the man she loved. "If he went with the Westerners," Nebamun said at last, "he went with a foreman named Jedor. He's clever, he drinks little, he buys the favor of guards and the silence of neighbors. If your husband returns, it will be with Jedor's footprints beside his. If he does not, it will be because Jedor told him to carry the heaviest sack." The woman's mouth tightened. She left without thanks, then returned as if she had forgotten something she was ashamed of forgetting. "Have you ever touched a king's mask?" she asked softly. Nebamun's eyes slid to the back of the tent where a wrapped bundle rested under a plank. "Only in dreams," he said. "That's the safest way." Jedor, meanwhile, was sorting men by the darkness under their eyes and the quickness of their hands. He chose 10. He always chose 10, and never the same 10, a superstition he would have mocked in daylight. One of them was the woman's husband, a man named Mena, whose back had a curve in it from years of lifting the Nile's gift onto barges. Mena was strong in the wrong places and tired exactly where a god would press if a god wished to test a man's resolve. They moved with the moon. They moved as if the cliffs were sleeping and might wake if footsteps slapped carelessly on the hard ground. Jedor carried a length of copper wire to test sealed doors, a bundle of reed plugs for lamplight, and a goatskin full of water, blessed without a priest. He did not believe in blessings, but he believed in repeating whatever had worked the last time. The tune they chose was quiet in the way that makes the inside of the ears ring. Its entrance had been choked with rubble by careful hands who understood that time is a kind of guard dog who only needs a wall to lean against. The men worked in shifts, moving stones from one darkness to another, wiping dust with the back of the wrist. Somewhere under all that, a painted corridor waited like a throat. Jedor pushed his wire beneath the plaster where the lintel and jamb kissed.
The wire came back with the bitterness of natron on it. New seals. Old tomb. Someone has already eaten here, and someone else tried to hide the bones. He smiled with half his mouth. Good. It means we are near the marrow.
Inside, the first chamber welcomed them with a relief of the king meeting Hathor, filigreed with 1,000 tiny brown mosquito bodies glued to the paint by centuries of funerary oil. The lamps made the goddess's cow ear seem to twitch. Mena did not look at the goddess. He looked at the floor to see where other feet had scuffed. He found them, a scatter of black brittle bits near the far wall that was resin fallen from a jar recently disturbed. A smear that swallowed light rather than reflected it, that was bitumen softened by heat and then broken. And there, along the left side, a drag line, the mark of something heavy being pulled toward the door weeks or months ago. This was not untouched. This was the mouth of an animal that had already eaten and might still be chewing. Jedhor grunted approval at Mena's eyes. The corridor bent. The world bent with it. The heat sank as they descended, and the damp that is not damp, the breath of long-dead balm, wrapped their lips with sweetness that wanted to be kindness and could never quite be. They came upon a sealed niche with a goddess painted on its plaster, Nephthys with arms outstretched. Jedhor broke the plaster where her hand met the border, and the hollow behind the wall coughed dust in his face. Ushapti's soldiers looked out at them, their blue faces amused. 10 men, 10,000 servants for the other world. Jedhor took 3 and left the rest, because men who leave nothing never learn when to stop. The burial chamber took them as a temple takes a prayer, completely, then slowly, then forever. The sarcophagus was not granite this time, but wood, swaddled in gold as thin as breath. A false door behind it bore a vertical column of names that had once meant everything, and now meant only, this is where the treasure is concentrated. Around the room, jars dozed under caps of linen that had fused to their rims like scabs. A chest with inlay missing from 3 corners waited against the wall. Mena imagined it as a mouth with 3 teeth gone, and could not unanxious himself out of the picture. Careful, Jedhor said. The Egyptians trapped for the living as much as they prayed for the dead. He tapped the floor with the butt of his lamp, hollow in one quadrant, solid in the next. He moved along the edges, tested a strip before stepping on it, then knelt beside the chest. 2 pins sealed it, wood swelled with age, brittle enough to break if you asked the right way. He asked gently. The lid yielded. Inside, squares of gold leaf lay stuck together like old honey. Jedhor lifted them and laughed the laugh that men try to swallow and never do. Mena felt something in his chest shift as if a new bone had grown. But gold is a patient animal that wakes when you call its true name, and the true name is your own. When Mena lifted a packet of cartilage-thin foils, a shape came with it, a curved eyebrow, the edge of a cheek. A mask face peered up at it, its eyes blank where obsidian had once been. He was not afraid of masks. He had seen them in life on noble ladies, whose faces were already half burial. What frightened him was the way the mask's blankness knew exactly how heavy his heart had become in a single breath.
The men moved riches into sacks until the sacks looked like sleeping dogs. Jedhor rationed his greed like a man who knows the dessert will be better if he saves appetite. They left the rings on the mummy's wrapped fingers because wrapped fingers look more alive than honest ones. They left the gold tongues that had been placed between teeth because to fish them out you must put your own fingers in a dead mouth, and even men who swear they are beasts do not like that. They turned away from the heart scarab because its spell glows in the dark of a man's head even when the lamp is out, and the last thing any thief wants is to hear the confession of a stone. When they were done, the air felt lighter, as if the room had exhaled. And then it did. A sigh moved through the chamber, a sound like worn linen torn in sleep. The lamp flames bent as if something had walked between them and their wicks. Jedhor lifted his hand for silence, which was ridiculous because silence is a thing that comes, whether called or not, in such places. The sigh happened again, from the corridor this time, as if a tall person had passed and brushed the painted stars with hair. "Out," Jedhor said, voice thin and practical. "Out, out, out." They backed through rooms that could count, past gods that now seemed to be looking where they had not looked before. At the threshold stone, Mena turned, because men always turn at thresholds, and saw the coffin's gold catch the lamplight in a way that made it look wet. He did not stop to decide whether that wetness was in the world or only in him. He stepped into the blackened night. Jedhor changed them from thieves back into men with heavy baskets by the simple act of leading and not speaking. They moved along a wadi whose sides had collapsed in some old flood, hiding their shadows under ancient scars. When the sky began to lighten enough to give things names, they were already within sight of the river. They made for Kayam-Necher, because in the economy of sacrilege, the man who pays quickly is the man who keeps you from paying later in other coin. He unwrapped their bundles and let the lamplight touch the gold in a courtyard that smelled of stewing onions and donkey sweat. He did not touch anything except with his eyes, and even those he wiped on the hem of his robe before he used them. "Too much," he said softly. "You bring me too much at once, and not enough of what is safest. Never bring eyes. Eyes remember their sockets." He pushed aside an inlaid lid and found the masked face Mena had lifted by mistake. Its blank gaze reflected two Kayam-Nechers, one inside each pupil. "This," he said, "is a mouth that will not stop talking. Melt it tonight or throw it back where you found it. If you sell it as it is, it will call all the wrong ears." "What about calling the right ones?" Jedhor said. "Right ears are not deaf long enough," Kayam-Necher said, "and they wear earrings welded to temple walls."
They haggled in whispers, as if gods could understand the difference between copper and silver. Kayam-Necher paid more than he said he would, and less than Jedhor wanted. He wrapped each piece separately in cloth that had once been a scribe's robe and now served a holier purpose, concealing sins. He watched Jedhor's hands as they counted and saw the tremor that greed gives even to steady men. He watched Mena's face and saw a kind of stunned wonder, like a child who has swallowed river water and cannot decide if he likes drowning. Kayam-Necher's nephew crept from behind the jar and peered at the mask. Its mouth had a chip along the lower lip that made it look as if it were biting back a word. The boy reached to touch it. Kayam-Necher slapped his hand. "No," he said, sharper than he meant. "Not with skin. Not with eyes." He wrapped the mask again the way men wrap children in winter and stowed it under the plank. It felt no safer underground than it had in its tomb. For 2 days the city moved as a body that has not yet admitted a wound. The priests performed mourning rites with voices pressed flat by fear that smelled like old incense. A scribe in the vizier's court finished copying an account of grain allotments and added in a smaller hand a note about rumors near Habu. A ferryman found a black strip of linen caught in his rudder and felt his throat close around a prayer he had not said since his mother died. A cat wandered into Kayam-Necher's stall, sniffed the place where the mask slept, and fled so fast its back feet skated out from under it. The woman in the veil returned. Her eyes were raw, the way a mouth is raw after winter oranges. "He came home," she said, and Kayam-Necher knew by the shape of her voice that home did not mean what it usually means. "He held our son as if he remembered holding something heavier. He did not sleep. He kept listening at the door." "Some doors only open when you listen," Kayam-Necher said, meaning it to comfort, failing. He would not touch me. He would not touch the bread. He lay down and put his hands on his chest. How? Nebamun asked before he could stop himself. Crossed, she said, and crossed hers to show him. By morning he was cold. He stared at the dust motes over his stall. They swam like hatchlings in sunlight. He had seen this before. He would see it again. Bring me his amulet, he said gently. Whatever he wore at the end, bring it to me and I will break it. Sometimes that helps. Sometimes the thing that witnesses our sin must be blinded. She reached under her veil and produced a little blue Ushapti soldier with a chip at the shoulder. He bought this for our son on the day we married. He told the boy it would work in the fields of the West in his place. Now my boy thinks it has work to do here. She set it down so carefully it made no sound. What do I tell him?
That men are stupid and gods are bored, Nebamun said, with a tired compassion that looked like cruelty and was only despair, and that the river carries both away if we let it. She left without the Ushapti. Nebamun stared at it until the dye in its glaze became little lakes. When he finally looked up, Jedhor stood in the alley, face pale where it was not dusty. More, Jedhor said. We go tonight, the same place. You go nowhere, Nebamun said. Turn your shirt inside out. Sleep on your roof. Do not step onto ground that remembers your weight. That's everywhere, but try. Wear a woman's perfume so the jackals don't know you. Better yet, bury your own mouth so words cannot crawl out of it. You cannot go back so soon. The chamber had 4 jars we left, Jedhor said, as if that sentence could outweigh a curse. And the false door might open to a second room. Even kings are not this greedy, Nebamun said, and Jedhor smiled humorlessly, because he had seen kings and knew better. We go, Jedhor repeated. The men are already sand sick. If I don't lead them, someone worse will. He left a minute later with an amulet Nebamun did not remember giving him. It was a tiny heart made of carnelian carved badly by a nervous hand. Nebamun realized then that the boy had edged back into the stall and traded things without knowing his fingers had moved. When dusk thickened, how swiftly it thickens on days when men have made the desert angrier than usual, the 10 moved again, except there were 9. Menna lay wrapped on his mat with hands crossed and the smell of natron heavy enough to make flies salute. His wife sang to him the childhood song about the falcon who forgets the path home and finds it anyway. Jedhor had sent coin. The coin felt cold as bone. In the valley, the wind changed directions 3 times. That is a thing wind never does without a reason. The men entered the tomb through their own hole and found footprints inside that were not their own. They found the jars moved, the chest lid ajar. They found a strip of linen on the floor like a shed skin. Jedhor pointed toward the sarcophagus with his chin because his mouth had dried shut. The wrappings were disturbed. The gold foil on one cheek was torn as if steeped in hot breath. Someone else, one man whispered. No, Jedhor said, and did not explain what he meant because he could not speak the thought. The masks of gods on the wall had grown shinier in 2 days. That is a thing paint never does without a reason. They lifted the jars because courage is a habit, and habits do not check the weather. Inside, the viscera were perfectly preserved, each jar a still life of eternity. Yet the lids had new scratches, marks as if teeth had been pressed gently on the clay. The room's corners seemed higher than before, and the center lower, as if the tomb were weighing itself and finding imbalance.
The men worked quickly. Quickly is a tempo that pleases fear. As they turned to leave, a thread of linen snagged on Jedhor's anklet. He looked down and saw it lead back across the floor and up the side of the coffin and into the crack beneath the lid. A thread that seemed to breathe. He bent, and the linen tightened as if someone inside wished him nearer. He cut it with his knife. The sound it made was the sound of hair cut close to the scalp. The lamp went out in a breath that did not come from lungs. They ran without dignity, bruising shins, forgetting the careful stepping pattern that had spared them earlier. Behind them, the sigh came again, then a footfall, then a drag. Men do not mistake that sound. Every child knows it from nightmares that arrive before memory has furniture in the room. One man turned to lift his friend and found he was holding a linen bundle heavier than it should be. He dropped it and did not look to see whether it unrolled. Outside, the sky had crouched close to the earth as if to listen. The moon showed one tooth. The men scattered by instinct because groups attract attention. Jedhor did not count them until he reached the shelter of a broken statue where the king's ear lay on the ground. There were 7. He had brought 9. He waited until the first light hardened along the ridge, then went back to the mouth of the valley alone and listened. A raven croaked without enthusiasm. The sand made a sound like a man coughing far away. Jedhor returned to the city with the jars and their slick contents, and a face there had learned the weight of an invisible hand. Kanametra met him with a lamp already lit and 3 cloths ready, one for the gold, one for the clay, one for the story. Jedhor gave him the first 2. The third came out by itself. While he spoke, something thumped in the alley, as if a donkey had fallen. Kanametra's nephew froze with a fistful of dates. Another thump closer, rhythmic, like the bump of a boat against a pier. Jedhor and Kanametra stood very still. The third thump came from the wall itself. The lamp flame leaned hard toward the jars. The lids wiggled. Kanametra moved faster than he looked capable, snatching the nearest jar and ramming a reed plug into the seam of its lid. He tied it with a strip of his own headcloth. Jedhor copied him with the second and third. The fourth jar slid on the table and knocked the lamp. Oil went where oil loves to go. Flame found cloth. Smoke rose with the steadiness of a man who knows his work. They smothered it with a rug that had once been woven for a bride. When they lifted the corner, the fourth jar's lid was slightly ajar, enough that a smell like old honey and salt teeth escaped. Kanametra looked at Jedhor and saw a man preparing to drop everything in his life and walk into the river until it told him to stop.
"This ends now," Chaim Netjer said. "Give me the jars." He stacked them like children around the mask bundle beneath the plank. "You will go home. You will sleep on your roof with your feet toward the river and your head toward the west so your dreams can find their way. In the morning you will carry bread to the temple kitchens and pretend to be a man who never learns to count beyond 10. You will not go back." "I've left too much down there," Jedhor said. "I can feel the room leaning toward me when I sit." "That is not the room," Chaim Netjer said. "That is your heart. It is heavier than Maat's feather and wants to be weighed. Keep it away from scales." Jedhor left as the first sellers of figs shouted their fatigue into the street. Chaim Netjer unwrapped the mask with the chip at the lip and told it that he was done being its broker. "You go home," he told the gold. "You make your own price." He carried it to the river under his robe like a child he did not want the neighbors to count. He waded to his thighs, where the current would take anything that did not know how to hold on. He lifted the mask, and for a breath it reflected the small white of the sun that had just decided to rise. The gold looked alive the way fish look alive while they are still deciding if your net is real. He let it go. The river took it. The current shoulders everything, even choice.
He stood there long enough that a crocodile drifted nearby and decided against him, because men who stand still in dawn water are already half not in the world. That night, the neighborhood slept the way men sleep after equity is restored in some mysterious ledger they pretend not to believe in. Chaim dreamed of scarab shells and woke with a husk stuck to his cheek. He brushed it away and found a line of grit along his lip, a crescent, like the mask's chip. He laughed angrily at nothing and cleaned his mouth as if a woman he admired were at the door. 3 mornings later, a boy running messages from dock to dock shouted that the river had vomited treasure near the quay by the fishermen's quarter. Men and women crowded the bank. In the reeds, half buried in black mud, lay the mask, its chip grimed, its eyes filled with river silt. It had drifted upriver against the current, or had simply waited in a whirl for the right audience. The fishermen would not touch it. A temple guard waded in and lifted it by the chin, the way midwives lift newborns. He wrapped it in his cloak and marched toward the precinct, and the people parted for him, the way barley parts for wind in a story told by someone who misses barley. Chaim stood back and closed his eyes. He had tried to return the animal to the dark. The animal had learned the path to market. That afternoon, the vizier's scribes announced raids on suspected fences. Chaim stall was searched with a priest's thoroughness and a soldier's hands. The jar under the plank trembled, but did not speak. The nephew learned that day how to lie with wide, innocent eyes, and later he would hate himself for how easily he discovered the shape of that expression on his own face.
They did not find the jars. They found only a blue ushapti that belonged to a boy who believed work could be shared across worlds if love made the contract. They found amulets that smelled of new glue. They found dates and a mat and a man who had learned to be a wall. The guard with the cloak and the mask looked at Chaim for a long time. The eyes in his head were less curious than the eyes in his folded cloth. No one said anything that could be written down. That night, the jars began to hum. It was not loud. It was the sound 2 reeds make when pressed together by a thoughtful child. Chaim woke, listened, and thought about the smell of the woman's hair the day she brought him grief to break. He rose, took each jar in his arms the way men carry sleeping infants, and climbed the stairs to the roof where the sky could do half the work. He set them in a row with the river at their feet and the west at their crowns, as he had told Jeddor to do with his own body. The humming did not stop, but it seemed less like a voice and more like a memory of a voice. He sat beside them until dawn returned the world's edge. The next evening, when he came up to check the jars, one was gone. The mat had not shifted. The rope around its lid lay where it had been, as if the jar had unknotted itself and stood up and walked away. The neighbors had heard nothing, because the kind of ear that hears jars walk is not the kind that hears children cry. Chaim stared at the empty square of roof until the square turned into a door. He did not look inside. He did not go downstairs. He did not sleep. At first light, he took the remaining jars to the only place that never asks questions, the river, and stepped out farther than before. The first jar sank, and then rose, and then sank again, and did not return. The second seemed to hang in the current like a thought that refuses to commit to being remembered. The third tipped, coughed a slick that spread like a prayer too late, and then spun once and was gone. Chaim stayed in the water until the frogs reconsidered their opinions about him. When he climbed onto the bank, something lay at his feet. It was the carnelian heart he did not remember giving Jeddor. It looked brighter than a stone should look after a night in the river. He left it there. A dog came, sniffed it, and would not carry it away. Jeddor did not return to Kayamnetjer. He did not return to anyone. Men said they saw him walking toward the western horizon at noon, which is a foolish time to walk anywhere. A child said he saw Jeddor stop at the ear of the broken statue and kneel and press his mouth to the stone as if telling it a secret. No one argued with the child, because children sometimes tell the truth when it has lost patience with adults.
Mena's wife burned the Ushapti with resin and herbs, and threw the ashes on her roof so the west wind could carry work back where it belonged. Her son stopped waking at night with fists clenched around nothing. She combed her hair with a bone comb and did not sing for a month. When she finally did, her voice found notes it had not known, as if grief had carved out a deeper instrument for her to play. The vizier's scribes opened a trial into tomb robberies and recorded names that have not survived and punishments that have. They wrote of hands cut, of noses split, of beatings that explained the law to the body. They wrote, too, of priests who had moved kings from one tomb to another, stripping their wrappings for amulets with the same blank efficiency as thieves. They wrote this carefully, in a script so small it could be missed if the reader wished to miss it. The law likes to keep its mirrors covered. The mask went to a temple. The jar that walked went who knows where. The cornelian heart stayed on the riverbank long enough for reeds to learn it and birds to refuse to stand near it. And in the valley, the sigh came less often, though it never fully stopped, because gold remembers the shape of hands and will always hope to feel that shape again. They will say later that curses are stories told by the poor to explain rich misfortune, or by the rich to explain poor audacity. Perhaps. Here is another angle. Gold is the most reflective thing the sun ever learned to trust. Hold it long enough, and you will see your own face without the lies skin tells. Some men cannot tolerate that. Some cannot stop. When the wind shifts over Thebes and the western cliffs throw their evening shadow across the river like a king laying his hand over a subject's mouth, listen closely. You will hear a sound like a lid being eased back into place, slow so as not to wake a sleeping child. You will hear beneath that the scrape of linen on wood. These are not ghosts. These are the scales of Mot adjusting, feather to heart, heart to feather, as if a clerk with ink on his thumb were doing the math again and again, trying to balance a ledger no era has balanced yet. The curse of gold is not death. Death is generous and punctual. The curse of gold is appetite, how it climbs from the dead into the living and teaches them a grammar of wanting that has no past tense. And if you listen long enough, you will understand what the desert has been saying since the first brick learned where to lie. The only thing that belongs in a tomb longer than a body is a story. Everything else finds its way back into hands or into water or into the mouths of those who do not learn until too late that gold's first language is hunger, and its second is home. On the night when the moon shaved itself into a crescent, fine as a blade, Kayamnetjer woke to a coolness at his feet and looked down to find sand there, as if he had walked in his sleep through every room where kings still pretend to lie. He brushed it away and found a line across his skin where a strap might have been worn for a burden. He stood, crossed his hands on his chest as a man might cross them to test a thought, then forced them apart and laughed once, softly, at himself and at the dark, and at the river that now sounded, to his ear, like gold scratching at a door it had already learned how to open. The first names arrived on palm leaves that smelled of smoke and sleep. They came to the office of the vizier at dawn, when the Nile still held the moon's reflection like a coin it meant to spend later.
A boy carried the basket of papyri with both hands, as if ink could break. He set it at the threshold and bowed until his forehead touched the cool stone. Inside, a scribe named Nebamun lifted the top sheet and felt, with a disgust he mistook for pride, the satisfaction of a system reasserting itself. At last the city would become a ledger again, and not a rumor. At last there would be columns where fear could be arranged. Nebamun was not young. The knots in his fingers had the shape of long obedience. He had copied hymns to Amun in a fairer hand than the priests who chanted them. He had recorded births with a flourish, deaths with a smaller one. He understood what was owed to the living and what to the dead. He even understood, against his will, the taxmen, for whom all lives were sums and harvests merely lines waiting to be ruled. But grave robbery troubled him in a way that taxes did not. Taxes move forward, tombs pull backward. To set one against the other was to ask a reed pen to write on wind. The vizier's chamber smelled of sweat dried into cedar. The seal ring pressed its crescent into clay again and again as the names began to form a river on his desk. Jedhor, the foreman, missing. Menna, the boatman, dead. An unnamed guard, laughing one day, gone the next, as if a shadow had eaten him. A broker at Medinet Habu, quiet, dangerous. The river, that gossiping god, had coughed up a golden face and promptly taken nothing else back. The city murmured that the kings were walking. The priestly college countered that the gods were testing obedience. The vizier countered them both with lists. Nebamun, he said, you will take the record of these examinations. Be thorough. If a man sneezes, write which god owns his nose. I will write what happens, Nebamun said. You will write what is needed, the vizier replied, which meant the same thing until it didn't. The examinations took place in a court that had once served as a granary. The bins were empty, which made it efficient for justice. The emptiness echoed. The Medjai, the desert police, led in the bound men at noon. Their feet were bare. Bare feet hear the floor. Nebamun dipped his pen, smoothed the papyrus fibers with the back of his nail, and wrote the date in a hand so exact that if the sun had stopped at that moment to check, it would have nodded, satisfied. The first accused was a mason with shoulders like quarried blocks. He would not look at the mummiform god painted on the wall. He looked only at Nebamun's pen, as if it were a serpent that might strike a number from his life. The Medjay put questions to him in voices that did not need to be cruel to be full of old practice. Whose tomb? They asked. I no longer remember the king's name, he said, and this was either true history or the beginning of a curse. When the Medjay pressed him, he spoke in the practiced cadence of those who have learned confession as a craft. The corridor angled left. The ceiling stars were painted with orpiment that shone even in lamplight. The jars sang when touched. The jars sang. Nebamun hesitated. He wrote it anyway. The pen knows that not all facts are true, and not all truths are factual. The paper took the word and held it without judgment, as papyrus always does. Under the law, the accused could be beaten to encourage memory to unstick. The Medjay performed this craft with a patience almost pastoral. There was a way a man's voice changes when it stops trying to negotiate with pain and begins to place himself, brick by brick, inside his own story. The mason reached this place and told them the rest. The foil gold like breadskins, the rings laborers wear when they have eaten well, a mask that had a laugh chipped into it. He named Jidhir, who was missing, and Kayam-net-jer, who surely was not. He named Hori, though he called him the draftsman who runs from his shadow, which meant in the court's grammar that the man had already gone beyond paper. Nebamun wrote everything. His reed scratched a dry hymn to order. For a moment he felt glad the world had allowed him to remain a scribe and not a robber. Then the mason, eyes swelling, spoke a phrase that cracked something small and important inside Nebamun's ribs. "We took what the dead will not spend," the man said, "and the dead took back what they knew we could not replace." "What was that?" a Medjay asked, bored enough to be curious. He did not answer. He stared at the painted god and bowed without lowering his head. Another band came in, a guard whose left ear had been torn long ago and had healed into a comma. He named a priest who had moved bodies from one tomb to another to thwart Thebes and pocketed amulets during the transit. The court grew warmer. Truth is a kind of fire that priests pretend to have invented. This kind came from meaner wood. Names were coals. The vizier's scribe caught each ember on leaf and prayed it would not burn through.
As afternoon sagged, a woman entered with her veil knotted under her chin in the style of long walks. She was not summoned. She had the permission of hunger and grief, which no vizier can deny without losing his own standing with the gods who count tears. "I will speak," she said. "I will speak what has already happened so that you can pretend you caused it." Nebamun admired her. The vizier gestured that she might proceed, which meant he would allow her to say what he could not hear, and then later say that he had. She told them about Mena, about the way hands crossed on the chest can be a request or a surrender. She told them about a little blue Ushapti that always faced west no matter where it was placed, as if the soul inside were homesick and impolite. She did not weep. When she finished, the vizier nodded to Nebamun. "Write it." He wrote it. The ink dried to a gray that would be legible when the men in the room were dust and the gods had learned different names. They brought in Netcher under a courtesy veil called questioning. It looks like respect and smells like fear. He walked as if the alley had not ended behind him, but simply bent into this room. He held his hands together in front of him, not bound, but admitting possibility. "You sell amulets," the vizier said mildly, which is the way a crocodile begins a conversation with a fish. "The city does not forbid commerce in the small comforts of piety, but you also buy." "I buy stories," Netcher said. "Objects are merely their illustrations." Nebamun did not look up. He wrote the sentence because it was elegant, and elegance is a kind of evidence. The vizier asked about masks. "Some faces returned to market unsummoned," he said, and even he heard the poetry in his own threat. "Have your customers brought you a certain face with a certain laugh?" "I return what I can to water," Netcher said. "The river knows how to erase. Sometimes it writes back." "You know the foreman," the Medjay pressed, "Jedhor?" "I know men who pretend they are foremen because they fear being merely men," Netcher said. "This one is learning to be a shadow." The vizier sighed. He was a tired man with a busy god, and his patience was a purse with the bottom rotted out. He signaled. The Medjay moved Netcher behind the partition called mercy, where the law explains itself to the spine. Nebamun did not watch. He counted the fibers in his papyrus to stay useful. When Netcher returned, he looked smaller, which is the law's argument for its own existence. Blood threaded his lip. He did not wipe it. "If I tell you what I know, you will fill in the rest with what you need to believe. Better that I let you do all the work yourselves. You are good at it." The vizier leaned forward. He said, "You mistake me for a priest. I need the city quiet. I need the kings to sleep. I need the granaries to be less empty than they are. Tell me where the next hole is."
Netcher told him. The word left his mouth like a bird he had fed too well. That night, Nebamun copied the day's testimonies onto long rolls in a hand so large an unlettered man could feel the meaning with his fingertip. Charges, names.
"We broke the seal with a chisel, chanted over by a woman who had lost a daughter. The jar sang. The mask returned. The river returned it again." He marked each with the seal of the office. When he lifted the seal from the clay, he felt the slightest pull, as if the papyrus wished to cling to the ring. He laughed at himself. Ink sit too long and a man goes fanciful. He went home by the moon path many scribes take when their eyes are too full of ink to bear the sun. His house backed on an alley the cats had designated as theirs. He washed the pen stain from his fingers with water that had not traveled far enough to be holy. He lay down on his mat and expected the usual parade of gulfs and numbers to march across his sleep. Instead, the papyrus marched. Letters formed in the dark like insects and then unformed. Names he had written stood up from their lines, shook the ink from their feet, and walked away toward the west wall. He woke with his hand making the cutting motions scribes use to sever a roll from its reed. In his fist he held a line of grit. He smelled resin. The night tasted of bitumen and coins. In the morning his wife asked why there was sand on his lip. He kissed her forehead, then kissed his child, and paused at the boy's chest. He had placed a small green stone there, as fathers do when their love invents a magic they will never admit to in daylight. The stone had rolled to the left. The child breathed softly with the seriousness of kings. Nebamun moved the stone back to center and told himself that superstition is merely a quorum of strangers agreeing not to say they are afraid. At first light, the vizier's party crossed the river with medjay and torches and the kind of optimism that looks like armor if you squint. Nebamun went with them because the law requires a witness who can draw straight lines. The cliffs rose with their usual insolence. The valley accepted them grudgingly, as if it could smell how temporary men are, even when they bring ropes. Camnetcher's word was true. The entrance was a polite lie of rubble over a careful door. The medjay moved stones until a seam flashed back a tiny smile of gold leaf. The vizier did not enter. Viziers know better than to go first into any room the gods have not been paid to attend. He gestured. Men who score their bravery and scars went in. Nebamun went last, which is the safest place to be if fear is behind you, and the most dangerous if it is in front. The corridor was shoulder's width, painted with stars that refused to be dull. On the right-hand wall, a goddess raised both hands in blessing, or warning. The air pressed on their cheeks as if the tomb were ajar and men were new bees. Someone coughed. The cough echoed in a way that made it sound like a stranger was correcting the pronunciation.
They reached the chamber. It was tidy in the manner of rooms recently rearranged by calm hands. The chest was closed, the jars set in the four gods' order, the sarcophagus lid misaligned by 2 finger widths, which is exactly how far a living man can move a heavy stone when he is afraid he will be caught doing it. The vizier stayed at the threshold. "Inventory," he said, and the medjay began to speak the names of things to the air, while Nebamun made them wooden by writing them down. Chest, cedar, inlay of faience missing, tick. 4 canopic jars, lids of duamutef, quebesenuef, hapi, imseti, sealed, tick. Collar of gold leaf, tick. Mask, the medjay hesitated, absent. Nebamun left a space and drew a box around it. The box looked like a door that did not intend to open. When they shifted the sarcophagus lid to square it, the air under it sighed, as though relieved to be given back its proportion. Nebamun felt his scalp crawl in politeness, the way hair lifts to greet a breeze at the river. The mummy lay where it should. Its wrappings were perfect in their imperfection, patched and rewound by hands that had cared enough to be tired. A heart scarab lay over the chest. The scribe did not look too long at the inscription, because a man who reads a heart on behalf of the law risks learning what the law intended to hide from him about himself. On the floor near the threshold, someone had written with a finger in dust a single hieratic line, dull and exact. Nebamun knelt, reached for his brush, and stopped. The line was not ink, it was ash. He read it aloud despite himself. "We took what we thought was metal. It was a name." His voice felt like a candle with too much wick. "Write it," the vizier said, and Nebamun did, though the ash smeared and the letters refused to sit where he set them. When he finished, the line on the floor had softened into a smudge, which is what happens to all writing that tells more truth than the room was designed to carry. They removed nothing, they resealed what they could. The vizier posted guards. He did not realize that guards are most useful against men who come and go by doors. The thing that walked here had long since learned the walls. The trials continued for 7 days that felt like one long afternoon. Papyrus piled itself into tiers like a small cliff of certainty. Nebamun's hand cramped into a hook at the second knuckle. He soaked it at night in oil and murmured apologies to a body that had never asked to be a public instrument. The Medjai learned new names and wore them out. The vizier collected the whole in a bundle tied with blue cord, the color certain gods favor for oaths. He imagined the sound the roll would make when he thumped it on the vizierial table, the sound of the world made again into syllables.
On the 8th night, the wind shifted from the west at midnight, a thing it does only when the desert remembers an appointment. Nebamun woke to the sensation of someone smoothing a sheet over his chest. His hands flew up, caught linen that was not there, and found the little green stone pressed hard against his sternum, as if it had crawled there. His child slept with his mouth open in a circle of soft astonishment. The scribe stood and went to his writing board, and in the dark he could see as clearly as if it had been afternoon a new line on the papyrus he had left blank for that purpose. The space where the mask's name would go if it ever consented to be named. The line was filled, not with letters, with a gold smear. He touched it. His finger came away clean. The stain remained. In the morning, he brought the roll to the vizier and did not mention the stain. The vizier did not mention that his own seal ring had stuck to his finger like a leech when he tried to remove it. They were men who knew which parts of a story belonged to daylight. Verdicts were pronounced. They sounded like the river in winter, low, inevitable, choked with old branches. Some men lost hands. Some men lost noses. Some men were told to work in quarries that eat men slowly enough to be called mercy. Kayemnetcher was released to his stall with a mark on his shoulder that said, "Remember who remembers you." The woman in the veil received a measure of grain, pressed so stingily the clerk who measured it blushed. The court closed its door at sunset and congratulated itself on the sturdy architecture of order. That night, the guard posted at the newly resealed door in the western valley heard footsteps inside the rock. He pressed his ear to stone. The steps were measured and unhurried, as of someone accustomed to corridors that do not argue. They stopped on the far side of the blocked lintel. Then came another sound, small and ordinary. So ordinary the guard had to sit down to keep listening. The sound of gold leaf bending. If you have never heard it, imagine dry grass pressed under a sleeping child. Imagine thin ice deciding whether to remember spring. Imagine a tongue learning a word it has not had to say in 100 generations. He stood. He touched the door with his forehead. He said nothing to his relief at dawn because the body only holds so many stories without becoming a tomb itself. Nebamun slept that night at his desk. He dreamed, no,
He remembered in advance that someday men with foreign tongues would peel open the kings again in the name of knowledge and would call themselves different from thieves because their lamps were brighter and their papers more official. He remembered that their pens would also scratch, and that their hands would also tremble when a mask looked back at them with a laugh chipped along its lip. He remembered that those men would come to the city called Wasset and name it Thebes and then Luxor, and that all those names would be true the way nicknames are true, and that the sand would forgive them as it forgives everyone by covering the footprints and leaving the door.
He woke with his cheek stuck to the papyrus where the gold smear had been. It left no mark on his skin. He washed his face, kissed his child, and went back to the court to learn which part of order would be performed today. On the way, he passed Necher's stall. The broker stood with his hands folded and his mouth set as if he were trying to keep a bee inside it. On the mat, where the amulets usually lay, there was a single carnelian heart. No one would buy it. No one would touch it. The sun made a clean red of it that was indecent. Some things, Necher said without looking at Nebamun, do not return to silence when asked. Nebamun nodded, which is the way scribes agree with information their pens are not ready to carry. He walked on. The court door swallowed him. The clerk beside him unrolled a fresh sheet. The reed pens, dozed in water overnight, woke with a sigh. The vizier lifted his seal ring. The medjay leaned their staves against the wall with the practiced clatter that tells fear what time it is. "Right," the vizier said. Nebamun dipped his pen. The reed's tip touched the papyrus and made that first small scratch that always sounds, to a man listening for it, like a door beginning to open. The desert remembers in corridors. It keeps what matters not in piles, but in lines, processions of wind, columns of heat, files of men carrying what they should not carry at hours they should not be awake. On a moonless night, after the trials had tired the city into a sullen quiet, a line moved along the cliffs, lanterns muffled, sandals wrapped in cloth. They were not thieves, they were priests. They came from Karnak by the river paths no fishermen used after dusk, their white linen dark with resin stains that never truly wash away. At their head walked a high priest with a jaw like a scarab's shell and a voice sanded smooth by years of speaking to halls that echoed. He had received the vizier's request as if it were a temple hymn. The kings must sleep. If thieves would not let them, then the priests would teach the dead new beds. They called it protection. They called it right. They called it the only way to hold a boundary that hunger had made porous. The truth was simpler, heavier. They were moving gold. Not the obvious kind, the masks that copy faces and the collars that yoke light. Those the college had already locked in rooms no map admitted, behind doors that gave off the smell of cedar and secrecy. Tonight, they moved a weight harder to count. The names of kings, wrapped and renamed, shifted like constellations to a hiding place in the cliffs. The priests' chant held the names in their throats so the desert could not steal them. Deserk Heperure Setepenre Horamheb, Menpahitere Ramesses I, Hekama Utre Seti, Usermatre Mariamun Ramesses. Stars they pretended they had not burnt out for their own lamplight.
They entered a narrow cleft that looked like a seam the earth had been too tired to finish sewing. The high priest raised his hands, and the chant thinned, then stilled. He lifted his lantern and showed the men the first of the sealed doors, not royal, not splendid, only careful. This place had been cut in a time of fear and patched in a time of shame. Its name was not a name, but a number the priests spoke with their tongues bitten between their teeth, as if each digit had edges. Inside, the air pressed like water. The men moved as swimmers do, slowly, conserving breath, resisting the old urge to hurry away from judgment. Side chambers gaped with mummies stacked like papyrus rolls.
The smell was sweeter here, as if, in a kindness the living rarely offer one another, each body had agreed to keep its own story to itself. Linen whispered when shoulders brushed it. Every brush sounded, to Nebamun's memory, like a reed pen testing its point. Nebamun was not there. He dreamed it anyway, elsewhere in a house that had inherited too many court silences. In his dream he was a boy again, the world taller than it would ever be, and his father's hand a roof over his head as they walked through a harvest field. Wheat murmured. The same sound now wove through the priest's corridor as they lifted one king at a time from one eternity to another. The high priest kept count. Counting kings is a heresy the gods forgive if the tone is right. They had reached the third chamber when a sound came from the dark ahead. One step, then another, then the soft partial sound of a foot dragging a little, the way old men show their bodies respect. The priests were not brave men. Devotion has made cowards of braver. But their fear had learned to dress as duty. The high priest raised the lantern and made a prayer with his mouth closed. A figure stood at the corridor bend, tall and narrow in the light, wrapped to the chin, the jaw bound, the eye sockets shadow wells. It did not advance, it simply stood, swaying as linen sways on a line hung in still air. One of the younger priests made a sound his teachers would have called a vowel if the temple had trained him to sing. The high priest swatted the air as if to bat the sound away before it belonged to the room. He bowed, because there is, in every man who has drawn breath under a dome, some memory of honoring a shape that can see him. "Great One," he said, voice low, "we move you from danger to shelter. The thieves have desecrated the doors. We give you a stronger door." The figure swayed. The band at the jaw stretched and eased, as if a syllable inside it were testing whether there was still space in the world for it. The high priest felt heat creep up his spine, as if a hand inside his robe had learned the path to fear's throat. Then the figure's head tipped the smallest degree, and the air in the corridor loosened. The high priest bowed further. He turned to the bearers and nodded, and the line moved again, its center now a gap to let the wrapped one pass. It did, with the deliberateness of men who know distances measured after death. When it reached the far side of the lantern's sway, it bent into the dark as if the corridor had always been its own body, and it was simply returning to bone. They did not speak of it. That is how priests shepherd their small lights through long tunnels, by keeping the flame's attention on the wick and not the smoke.
They made the cache by midnight. It was a high chamber cut into the back of a cliff that had learned not to crumble. Niches lined it like ribs, each eager to hold a king's memory in a kind of order even hunger respects. The bearers laid the bodies by rain and temperament. A line of scribes with clay tablets and tired eyes wrote names as if names were rope. The high priest added curses to doorposts. Not old curses, those were exhausted, but new ones he minted from more recent coins. Shame, fear, famine, the law. He mixed them with sacred words and hoped the blend would fool anyone who came reading. When the last of the kings was settled, he turned to the back of the chamber where a smaller niche had been cut, unmarked, unblessed, insufficient for greatness. There the priests placed the ones who were not kings, the queen whose smile could not be unlearned. The prince who would have ruled had breath and knives agreed to leave him time. The daughter whose eyes had been painted so carefully the paint seemed wet. The high priest paused at the girl and pressed his thumb to the glassy black of her pupil. The pad of his finger tingled as if a tiny spark had leapt from obsidian to flesh. He almost apologized. He almost kissed her forehead through the linen. He made a sign instead, the small private one each priest invents for himself, the sign that means, I am not as strong as my robe. They sealed the cache by smashing the last ladder and stacking its splinters inside the door before plastering the opening with a care that looked like love from a distance. In the plaster they drew rough Heka signs, the magic knots that close where no timber can. The high priest spat in his palm and pressed it into the wet white. When he lifted it, a whirl remained that looked very much like a fingerprint on a guilty jar. He did not smooth it. Every rite needs a hinge. When they came out, the wind had risen. It came from the west. It always comes from the west when messages are going in the other direction. The priests tied their lanterns and moved with elbows tucked, the way men walk when the night would like to pull something off their bodies. They were halfway down the cleft when they found a man sitting where no man sits at that hour unless he has been assigned the position by a god or a story. He was barefoot. His ankles were wrapped with a strip of linen that led nowhere. His face looked like a thought someone had decided not to finish. Didor, one of them breathed, because Didor's name had begun to do the work of a proverb in the city, an explanation that did not explain, a ward that did not ward. The high priest crouched, lantern low. Didor's eyes were open the way a door is open when no one wishes to use it. On his lap lay a small roll of carnelian, beads strung in a pattern a child might have invented to soothe himself. His mouth had the oddest shape, a smile raised too high at one corner, the exact chip Chaim Netzer had noticed in the mask. The high priest's breath snagged. He did something he had not done since he was a boy pretending in an empty chapel. He put his hand under a stranger's head and called him, in a voice he had forgotten he still owned, "Son." Didor's head rocked, heavy with what it no longer needed. The strip at his ankles trailed into the dust and did not pick up dust the way ordinary cloth does. The high priest pinched it in between finger and thumb. Resin slicked his skin. He let it go. He said, "Bring him. He is not a thief. He is a sign." They carried Jedhor to a mortuary courtyard, left to weed in owls, and laid him beside a basin dry enough to remember floods. A lesser priest fetched natron and a sheet. The high priest shooed him away with a sharpness meant for dogs. "Leave him to air," he said. "Let the night decide which gods care." He covered Jedhor's face with his own robe's hem. That is the kind of blasphemy the gods admire and overlook. By dawn, the city had learned there had been a procession in the cliffs. The city always learns the right thing and the wrong one at once. Some said the priests had stolen from the thieves. Others said the dead had taken themselves to a new address, and the priests had merely followed with torches to make themselves feel necessary. The vizier issued a statement, written in Nebamun's steady hand, that said nothing except that everything was as it should be, and that anyone found in the Western Valley after dark would be taught the difference between bone and law. The statement calmed no one. Calm does not adhere to papyrus. It adheres to bellies. Kayemnicher received a visitor as the heat began its climb. The woman with the veil came without it, which made her look younger and more dangerous. She set an object on the mat, wrapped in a priest's sash. Kayemnicher did not touch it. "It found me," she said, "on my roof at dawn." "Things do not climb," he said, weary. "This one does," she said. She lifted the cloth. The carnelian heart lay there, red and exact, its hieroglyphs cut so shallow they were almost guesses. The stone had warmed under the sun. Heat bled into the air above it, a shimmer that bent the fly's approach. "My boy woke with sand in his mouth,"
she said too calmly, and the word west on his tongue, as if he had been using it all night. Kayamniger wanted to brush the heart with the back of his hand, the way a mother checks a child's fever. He laced his fingers in his sash instead. Throw it where the river will not return it, or give it to the fire. The river returns everything, she said, and fire remembers names. She rapped it again, and left with a stillness that made itself loud. Nebamun, summoned to the temple storehouse that afternoon, watched the high priest inspect rooms that had grown nervous. Shelves creaked, seals sweated salt. Linen packages made a soft settling sound altogether, which is a noise no living room makes unless wind passes through it. The high priest frowned at a niche where a mask sat under a net of cords. That one is a bad listener. It overhears itself. He signaled to a servant to cover it with a veil that had held real sorrow once, woven for a funeral the city had not earned. Let it hear grief instead. As Nebamun turned to leave, his shadow moved in a direction his body did not. He stopped and saw that the doorway's light had shifted. No, that someone had entered behind him without stirring air. He turned again and glimpsed a hem vanish around a pillar. A hem patterned in gold leaf the way scribes draw water with little vertical lines. The high priest did not look up. Do not name what knows its own name. It will only turn to see who is rude.
That night the wind ran backward through Thebes. It moved from graves toward cradles. Doors that had been secure in one direction sighed in the other. Nebamun lay on his mat with his child breathing against his ribs, and felt his own heart tap 3 times, as if a stranger had knocked softly from inside. He looked down. The little green stone had moved again without moving. He set it back. It rolled. He let it. Some time before dawn, the western cliffs made a sound like a cough, stifled in a public place. The guard at the sealed cleft felt it in his knees. He raised his torch to make light way more, and saw a moth burn to a crisp in an instant and turn, unexpectedly, into a smell like temple resin. He lowered the torch and waited for it to be morning a little faster. When day came fully, the priestly line moved again, this time not to carry kings, but to carry silence. They brought offerings to doors and pressed them into seals the way mothers press sweets into children's fists to quiet the way hunger complains. They spoke new names over old names until both blurred into a hum a jackal would refuse to listen to. They hung garlands of dried flowers at the mouth of the valley, as if the desert might be wooed. The vizier sent Nebamun to record the catalog of the cache, not in ink, that would come later, but in walking. How many steps from cleft to door? How many breaths from threshold to final niche? How many lanterns per corridor? How many men required to lift a king without making the linen complain? Nebamun walked and counted, and carved the numbers in a board he could rub smooth with oil when no one was looking. At the door he paused, hand on plaster still damp enough to remember fingers, and heard, not with his ear, but with the part of the skull that dreams live in, 2 words, spoken slowly enough to learn. Not done. He opened his mouth to say he agreed. Dust touched his tongue and made agreement a cough. The night after Thebes came anyway. Of course they did. The poor sleep where decrees do not. They found the new door and sniffed it like dogs puzzling over a different dog's mark. One of them laughed and said, "They've tucked the kings into a basket and handed it to us." Another, older, put his hand on the plaster and drew it back with resin strings between finger and wall. He wiped his palm on his robe the way a man wipes shame he expects never to confess. They left without digging. That, too, is theft. To come for gold and carry away fear. The high priest made a final circuit of the cache alone. He carried no lamp. He carried a question he did not dare phrase. He stopped before the girl in the side niche and leaned his forehead against linen that had known tears when it was first woven. He whispered, "We have done what we can." And the corridor's ribs carried the words into the ribs of the cliff. The air cooled against his skin. A minute passed, or a century, and in the odd half-sound the chamber makes when it chooses pity, he heard Liman shift, as if a child had turned in sleep and the bed had approved.
He left then, and the mountain sealed him out with its old, patient indifference. In the city, a broker wrapped his stall in canvas and told his nephew a story without ending. A scribe wrote a line and left its last word blank. A woman sat on her roof with a stone in her lap and watched the place where the river pretends to begin. Somewhere between, the dead rolled to make space for each other the way the living do on hot nights. The priests would later insist they had saved the kings. The kings would later say nothing at all, which is the excellence of kings. But the desert, which answers only to titles older than crowns, had already revised the story into a shape truer to its grain. Men moved what they had worshipped and believed that by moving it they could change the thing it was. The curse, if that is what one wants to call the ledger that never balances, took careful notes and smiled its chipped little smile and waited, as it always does, for hands to resume their ancient work of opening what has been closed. Thebes fell not with a shout, but with the long inhalation of a city forgetting how to breathe. It began with small silences, the baker's oven that failed to crack at dawn, the ferry that crossed one beat late, the temple drum that hesitated between strikes as if the god behind it had looked away. Men told themselves it was the heat. Women blamed the river's sulk. The priests named omens in the dust, which is to say they named everything except themselves. But those who had carried kings through the night knew the truth that does not ask for priests. When you move the dead, the living must learn a new gravity. The desert brought its report in a new alphabet. Flies where none had wintered, scorpions at thresholds, jackals that watched and did not eat. In the alleys behind the mortuary temples, children began a game they had not played in generations. They crossed their arms on their chests and lay very still until the others forgot they were playing. Then they sat up and laughed, a laugh with one corner chipped, and everyone went home early without admitting why. The first time a mother slapped her son for it, he bared his teeth without meaning to and wept before she could. Nebamun wrote longer. His pen learned how to wait over a blank line until the page decided to accept it. The vizier brought more names and fewer instructions. The Medjai grew polite in a way men do when they weary of being feared. In the market, a seller of fish laid out his wares at sunrise and found them still bright at noon, their eyes too clear. He packed them away without selling one and drank water in short, careful sips as if his throat might tell on him. At Karnak, the priests increased ceremony the way a fever increases sweat. Incense burned until the pillars wept resin. The god's boat went out twice as often and came back as if it had done no work. The high priest, whose voice could lay brick when it found the right rhythm, let it crack one morning during the hymn to the rising sun. The crack ran through the choir like a line of bad mortar. He swallowed. The note did not mend. Kayemnecher watched his stall the way a man watches a sleeping snake he cannot afford to kill. The carnelian heart returned once more, left on his mat at dusk with no footprints around it, as if the stone itself wore sandals made of light. He took it to the river and spoke to it without bitterness. "You want a throat," he said. "You want a warm dark. Find one that says yes." He threw it hard into the brown where the frog songs knopped themselves. It did not splash. The heat lifted from the water, as if something had breathed in. In the village of the tomb workers, the first strike began again, echo upon echo of a history that had bruised Thebes in an earlier reign. Men laid down chisels and took up complaints measured in steps to the temple door. They shouted that their bellies had turned to bark, that their wives' earrings had gone to grain sellers with a smile and an abacus, that even the gods understood that a hungry artisan carves crooked. The overseers stood with ropes and the law behind them and waited for someone to move first. No one did. That was the horror of it. No rage, only resignation, the slow refusal born of men who had already carried kings. The strike was not noise, it was subtraction. On the third day of refusal, the wind from the west arrived with grit that tasted of old resins. Those who had embalmed once in their lives coughed and looked away from the cliffs as if embarrassed to be recognized in the street by an old shame. A girl ran along the riverbank shouting that a mask lay in the reeds, only to arrive where it should have been and find a nest of papyrus plucked into a perfect oval, as if something had rested there for the length of a breath and then remembered itself. The fishermen began to whistle when they raised their nets, the way men do to persuade the river to bring up only fish. Sickness came the way cats come, first one, then three, then you realize all corners are warm and occupied. It did not kill quickly. It learned each household's schedule and chose the hour when chores stand between hands and hearts. Men bent to lift jars and could not stand straight. Women turned bread on the stone and found the stone too heavy for bread. Children woke from naps with sand under their tongues. Mothers licked it away without thinking and found their own mouths dry. The doctor who believed in humors bled a woman who had no blood to give. The woman thanked him by surviving so faintly that he took it for an insult. Nebamun's wife wrapped a cloth around her hair and ground barley with more rhythm than song. She asked her husband if the quartz papyri had grown heavier. He laughed, and it broke. He kissed her hairline and tasted dust. Their child slipped longer, as if his dreams had learned to manage without him. When he woke, he pressed his small palm to the west wall and said a word that made no sense to his father, a name without vowels. The boy grinned the way bodies grin when they do not understand they had borrowed someone else's mouth.
Word reached the vizier that a cache had been breached despite the new door. It was not the cache the priests had sealed. It was one the priests had not admitted sealing, an older place, a fumbled attempt at safety. Names stashed in haste and forgotten on purpose. The robbers who entered came out with nothing but a furious certainty that there had been something to take. They went back with more men and ropes, and came out with the smell clinging to their hands that wives could not scrub off. 2 of them drowned without water in their lungs, their chests still crossed when their brothers found them. The Magi reported it with the embarrassment of men who have failed to explain a bruise. Nebamun wrote the line and felt the reed stutter. At Deir el-Medina, the foreman tried to count their crews and found their numbers sliding sideways. A mason answered to 3 names, and none of them stuck long enough to pay. A draftsman drew a corridor, and in the drawing, the corridor turned in a way corridors do not turn unless you have forgotten what the plan said. On the village wall, someone painted a jackal, and then, before the plaster dried, scrubbed it with a rag until the rag smelled like frankincense. Children traced the ghost of it with their fingers and called the smear the dog that knows. Their mothers dragged them away and told jokes too loudly. Nebamun took in less and gave out more. He broke amulets when women brought them with that look in their mouths that says, "If this does not work, nothing will, and I will not allow nothing." He told them the truth one cannot sell, that sometimes breaking is the only way to finish a thing. He burned a basket of shop tea and held his breath through the stink of old glaze. The crackle sounded like 1,000 tiny no's. In the morning, the ashes arranged themselves on his mat into a neat line pointing west. He swept them into a gourd and carried them to the river, hands shaking with a craftsman's rage at tidiness that comes at the wrong time. The high priest took counsel with men who had sworn not to need counsel. Their ring of silence was the loudest sound Thebes had heard in months. They spoke in the grammar of rites. We will redouble. We will process. We will cut a pig and read the lines where its fat refuses. We will speak the names in the place that names cannot be written. The high priest listened to himself the way men do when their own voices have become the only familiar texture in the world. In the middle of a list of things that had always worked,
He lifted his hand and said, "We will apologize." The room tilted. A junior priest dropped a tablet and pretended not to. "To whom?" someone asked. "To those we moved," he said, and the word "we" found them like a shiver finds the back of a naked neck. That night, he took a basin to the foot of the cliffs and poured water onto rock until the rock smelled alive. He did not expect forgiveness. He expected the ordinary decency of doors that stay shut after dark. The basin emptied itself with cool precision. He waited. The cliffs did not speak. The wind addressed him with a jackal's breath. He bowed to it, as if it were a king who had not yet decided what to do with him. Nebamun's dreams began to carry footnotes. He would wake with his cheek stuck to the mat and the memory of a line he had written, and underneath it he would recall, as if the papyrus had whispered through sleep, an older line that contradicted his. He started leaving margins for these ghostly counter-arguments. In the morning, the margins would hold nothing but a light brown smear, as of resin that had not quite stuck. He scraped it off with a bone blade and did not look at the blade afterward in case it had learned his face. Famine, which is the word the law uses when it cannot punish weather, made a procession across the plain. The army divided loaves by spear length. The priests hid bread under names, which is to say, they fed their god until the god grew nauseous. Robbers took to daylight. Farmers went to the city to sell air in baskets and received coin for it from men who needed to pretend. Babies learned to suck on fingers that had touched nothing sweet, and their eyes did not complain, which is how sorrow begins to think it is normal. Then the riots came the way storms come when the ground has stored lightning for weeks. The workers walked through the Medinet Habu gate and asked for grain. No one answered. They sat in the shade of the pylons, their backs to the gods, a blasphemy so practical no priest could invent a punishment big enough for it. One of them began to beat time on a mortar. Another tuned the time. The high priest appeared with a bowl of dates and 2 good words, and the men ate the dates and said the words with him, and then asked for grain again, because words are food only to those paid to pronounce them. Into this hunger came rumor of Libyans testing the edge of empire. Raiders behind the strip of green, their cousins in front of it. Kings who had to be carried out at night. A mask in a temple niche smiling at a scribe in a way that made him drop his pen. The vizier called the city to itself with proclamations stamped so hard the clay split. He ordered patrols to walk by twos, with their staves held like prayers. He doubled the guard at the new cache and slept with his ring on, waking twice to find it clenched between his teeth. On the 7th day of the second strike, a boy appeared in the court, not summoned and not stopped, because no one has yet taught a hungry boy that doors have moods. He placed a small object on the step and backed away with his hands open. It was a heart scarab, cut from stone the river knows as a sister. Nebamun knew it by its inscription. He had written it once when copying a funerary spell for a noble's household, his hand trembling as the line bent into an imperative. "Do not stand against me when I stand in judgment." The boy's scarab was cracked across that sentence. The crack made a new grammar. "Do stand against me when I stand in judgment." Nebamun looked up into the yard. No one claimed the boy. He bent and picked up the scarab with a rag that smelled of vinegar and carried it to the vizier, who stared at it the way a general stares at a map that begins to write itself.
That night, a brown fog moved from the west bank to the east without touching the river. It passed over roofs with the delicacy of someone searching for a particular sleeper. Those who woke with sand in their mouths did not spit. Those who rolled to the left with their hands crossed did not uncross them quickly. Kam-Netjir sat on his roof with his nephew asleep under his robe, and counted the number of lamps that burned all the way to dawn. He lost count. He began again. Count the lamps, and you will feel less alone. He counted until the sun elbowed the horizon aside. By now, even those who had scoffed at curses began to arrange their rooms differently. Beds moved away from the west wall. Shoes were set at odd angles, so that waking feet would misstep and break a pattern. Mothers kept the jars in which they stored barley slightly ajar, as if inviting the grain to breathe with them. A soldier hung his sword upside down to confuse whatever watched. A priest untied a knot in his sash and did not retie it before sleep. These are not rites. They are the choreography of a city that has noticed its reflection is half a step behind. The first of the Magi to vanish was a man who had once been a singer at Luxor, his falsetto the talk of processions. He had taken to humming on patrols. The night he disappeared, his partner heard his humming continue for 6 breaths after his body had ceased to share the air. When men went searching, they found only the reed plug he kept to tighten his lamp's mouth and a smear of gold on the doorpost, not leaf, not paint, pollen, perhaps, from a flower that blooms under stone. Nebamun sat at his board and wrote the testimony of a woman who claimed her husband had come home from the valley with a sack of gold leaf and a mouth that would not open. He wrote the testimony of a guard who admitted to lending his sandals to a thief so the thief's footprints would accuse the wrong man. He wrote the testimony of a boy who said he had seen a king walking without a mask. He wrote until his reed split up the middle with a sound like a bone obliging an autopsy. He sharpened another and finished the line. The court felt like a tomb that had learned to sit on stools. The high priest made a new procession, not for a god, but for absence. He had the choir sing in a lower key until the walls of Karnak vibrated and the pigeons in the hypostyle became briefly dignified. He had the boat of Amun carried without the god statue, an audacity so complete it might pass for humility. He stepped onto the barge himself and let the river hold him as if he were what he claimed to be. He stopped in the middle of the current and spoke to the west with his hands open. "We moved the kings because men were starving," he said, and men on both banks stiffened because truth spoken aloud in a crisis is either medicine or cutting. "We confess the arithmetic. We ask for sleep." The wind went flat. The oarsmen looked to one another the way men look when a silence decides to become an event. A single fish broke the skin and left a ring that traveled to the boat and tapped its hull like a knuckle. The high priest bowed to the ring as if answering a door. When he straightened, he looked thinner around the mouth. "We are heard," he said. No one asked by whom.
In the weeks that followed, the city learned a new patience. The strike ebbed because men can only be brave in public for so long without food. The riots calmed because rage that does not find purchase becomes superstition, and superstition prefers privacy. Netzer's nephew stopped dreaming of jars that walk and began dreaming of the number 4. He woke one morning with 4 grains stuck to his lip and kissed his uncle so hard it hurt. Nebamun's child put his hand against the west wall and then, after a small considering pause, took it away. The little green stone stayed where Nebamun placed it, a concession that made him shiver with gratitude and then ashamed of the shiver. It would be a comfort to say the curse lifted. Thebes would prefer a story with a hinge like that. What happened instead was older and truer. The city adjusted its breathing to the weight on its chest. The priests kept their cash, and the cash kept them. The robbers kept their ambition, and their names continued to blow through the vizier's door like sand that for once someone tried to count. The kings slept in rows that made sense only to the cliff.
Children learned to stop crossing their arms before they fell asleep. Mothers discovered new jokes. A mask was seen once more in the reeds and turned out to be a turtle. The turtle watched the watchers long enough to teach them how ridiculous they looked. But at night, when the heat let go and the jackals remembered they were not messengers, a thin sound still threaded the alleys. It was not a voice. Voices belong to mouths. This was the sound gold makes when it bends to become what a hand wants, the faint crisp of yielding, the leaf's ascent. Those who heard it turned over on their mats and faced east and counted their lamps, or their children's breaths, or the number of steps from their roof to the stair, and fell asleep despite themselves. One dawn, Nebamun woke before the birds and found his board lit by a glow too gentle for oil. He rose and stood over it and saw, no stain now, no smear, a line written in his own hand that he had not written, not done. He laughed softly at the courtesy of the tents. Then he went to the court with his reed and wrote the day, because that is what the living do when the dead keep count from their side. He wrote, and the city, which had remembered again how to breathe, exhaled into the heat and waited for evening, the way all cities do when they have learned to live alongside a patient animal sleeping under stone. Thebes had learned for a while to breathe again, but peace in Egypt was always a bargain struck with ghosts. The west wind carried silence from the necropolis, as though the cliffs themselves were holding their breath. People worked, but softly. The hammer blows at the workshops came muffled, as if the air itself were cushioning each strike. When a pot shattered, every head turned west. No one said why. They didn't have to. That year, the Nile rose too quickly. At first, the priests called it mercy, the god's apology for months of hunger, but the waters did not stop. They climbed steps carved for processions, filled the courts of Karnak, and slithered into the streets like a thing remembering a map it had once drawn. The farmers said the river was trying to wash away something it didn't want to touch.
Nebamun watched it from the terrace of his home. The floodlight turned every door into a mirror. In that reflection, he saw himself twice, once as he was, and once wrapped tight in linen. His child, the boy with the little green stone, laughed and said, "Father, the river is waking up." Nebamun answered without thinking, "No, son, the river is remembering." The priests of Amun gathered again, but this time their prayers had no rhythm. The high priest had grown thinner, his cheeks hollows carved by unslept nights. He stood before his peers and spoke without preamble. "The doors are failing." No one asked which doors, all of them knew. They sent runners to the valley caches, but none returned. One, a boy from Deir el-Medina, stumbled back at dawn, with sand up to his knees and skin cold as natron. He said he had seen torches burning underground. When the priests asked who carried them, the boy said, "No one," and began to laugh until the sound frayed into weeping. That same week, Kaimemkachur shut his stall. He told his nephew to pack the amulets, but the boy found that half of them had fused together, gold, faience, bone, all melted into one lump that pulsed faintly when touched. He took the fused mass to the river, the way he did with all things he didn't want to sell. But the river had grown strange. Its surface lay still, its reflection deeper than its color. When he dropped the relic in, it didn't sink. It floated for a moment, spinning, and drifted upstream. That night he heard voices, not the muttering of thieves or priests, but the low hum of something vast and old speaking through his walls. He couldn't make out the words, only their rhythm,
steady as breathing. When he pressed his ear to the floor, the sound grew clearer. We are not gone. We are beneath. In the palace, the vizier's council broke into argument. The army demanded conscripts to defend the frontier. The priests demanded men to guard the tombs. The farmers demanded bread that did not exist. Nebamun recorded it all in his ledger, each complaint like a heartbeat. He noted, without comment, that the vizier's hands shook when the high priest spoke. Seal the necropolis. If the people see omens, let them stay blind. But sealing the dead is like trying to cork smoke. At the western cliffs, guards hammered the last stones over the cleft where kings had been hidden. When they were done, they stepped back and watched the dust settle. One man, wiping his brow, noticed his footprints had filled themselves in. Another dropped his mallet and swore he heard breathing from inside the sealed door. By nightfall, every man who had worked on the wall had gone home. By morning, none had woken.
The sickness returned, but this time it carried dreams. Those who slept saw the valley from above, as if they were birds made of ash. They saw lines in the sand, long and deliberate, as though the desert were drawing a map to something it had buried too deep. When they woke, their hands were coated in fine dust. Nebamun stopped sleeping altogether. His child spoke to the wall again, pressing his palm flat against it. "They're not angry, they're lonely." Nebamun tried to pull him away, but the boy's hand would not lift. The wall held him gently, as if testing his pulse. When it finally released, the green stone on his chest had turned the color of dried blood. That night, Nebamun took his family to the temple. The priests barred the door. "This is a house of gods," one said. Nebamun answered, "Then you'd better ask your gods who's knocking." They let him in. The rites of defense began again, but they were not the old songs. The priests no longer prayed to banish darkness, they prayed to negotiate with it. They burned papyrus instead of incense, muttering over the ashes, names for names, silence for silence. The high priest walked barefoot around the temple 3 times, dragging a rope behind him, and tied it to the altar. "What are you binding?" Nebamun asked. "The memory of breath, so that it does not leave with the wind." For 3 nights the rope twitched. On the 4th, it went still. Beyond the walls, famine spread like rumor. Thebes was still a city of kings, but its markets smelled of death. Fish spoiled before noon, wine soured into vinegar. Gold changed hands faster than bread. The vizier's men raided houses for stolen relics, but every house had one, a trinket, a scarab, a charm dug from old ground. When the Magi tried to confiscate them, they broke apart like eggshells, releasing a smell like old perfume. People began to wear pieces of the past for luck, amulets on cords, unks on wrists, bits of painted wood tucked into belts. The more they wore, the hungrier they became. Nebamun watched them from his doorway. He said, "They are dressing for the grave, and the grave is flattered." One evening, a red haze crept across the horizon. Thebes turned the color of dried clay. In the haze, outlines appeared, figures walking in pairs, some tall, some stooped, some wrapped in what looked like wind. The guards at the gate dropped their spears and fled. The high priest climbed the steps of the temple and raised his hands. The figures stopped at the edge of the city. One stepped forward, its face veiled, its movements slow, deliberate. In the stillness, every flame in Thebes bent toward it. The priest's robe fluttered, though no wind touched it. "This is not your place," the high priest said. The figure tilted its head, the veil shifted. A faint sound followed. Laughter. Soft. Cracked. Unmistakably human. Nebamun saw it from the temple roof. "That laugh," he whispered. "It's the one on the mask." When morning came, the haze was gone, and so were 100 people, not dead, not missing, simply absent, like erased words on papyrus. In the sand outside the walls, hundreds of footprints led west. In the city, those who remained stopped asking where the curse came from. They began to ask what it wanted. The high priest said, "It wants attention." Chaim Netejer said, "It wants ownership." Nebamun, staring at his sleeping child, said softly, "It wants to be remembered." That night, the river whispered back to the desert. No one heard what it said, but the current slowed, and the moon's reflection on its surface looked exactly like gold leaf bending, as if the river itself were learning how to breathe beneath the weight of all those waiting names. And far beneath Thebes, in a corridor no longer marked on any map, linen stirred, not with movement, but with memory. The kings were awake. Thebes did not die when the kings awoke. Cities never die cleanly. They rot politely, bowing to decay as if to a visiting noble. The temples still smoked, though the incense had turned sharp, like the sweetness of fruit too long on the altar. The merchants still haggled, though the goods they traded were illusions, grain measured in shadow, linen cut from dreams. Even the river still glimmered, but it no longer spoke the same language as the sky. By now, no one counted the days. The calendar had grown shy, its priests forgetting which stars told the hour. When a star fell, they argued over whether it was a message or a punishment. The high priest said neither. It was a sign of exhaustion, a light choosing to lie down. The sickness returned, but this time it came not to the body, but to the earth. In the western cliffs, cracks widened, as if the mountain itself had been breathing in its sleep. Each night, the guards at the necropolis heard what they called the heart of the stone, a slow pulse deep underfoot, as though the desert had discovered rhythm. On the 4th night of the new moon, a tremor split the plaster over the cache door where the kings lay. The line was perfect, running from top to bottom like a deliberate incision. The plaster did not crumble. It parted cleanly, and a sigh rolled out, warm, sweet, and too gentle to be wind. In the city, every flame flickered inward, as though drawn toward some invisible breath. The priests dropped their censers. The smell of myrrh mixed with something older, the scent of wet linen and coppery dust. Nebamun felt it from across the river. He had been writing by lamplight when the ink trembled in its pot, spreading a thin ripple. The papyrus beneath his hand absorbed it, forming a circle of black that refused to dry. He touched it, and the ink sank through, leaving his finger wet with something thicker, warmer. Blood.
At dawn, the vizier's messengers brought news. The guard at the valley entrance had vanished again. No blood, no struggle, just the impression of bodies lying down in the sand, as if to rest. Their staves stood upright beside them, casting long shadows toward the west. The vizier did not send replacements. "The desert keeps what it loves," he said. "Let it keep its favorites." Nebamun recorded the order and wondered if the same would one day be said of him. Neter tried to leave. He packed a donkey with his remaining goods, half-charred amulets, jars of unblessed oil, the last 3 rolls of linen he hadn't yet sold to the priests. His nephew begged him not to go. "The sand will find you," the boy said. "It already has," Nefer replied, and looked down at his feet. The soles were cracked, but not from walking. The cracks were deliberate, like the ones on the plaster of the tomb doors. In the grooves, faint grains of gold gleamed. He scrubbed them raw with vinegar and salt, but the shine only spread. He left before dawn, following the southern road. The desert followed him back. By noon, the donkey returned alone. On its back hung one object, the fused lump of relics, warm and humming like a heart. In the evening, Nebamun visited the temple. The high priest sat on the steps, staring at the horizon as if reading a scripture written in wind. "The kings stir," Nebamun said. "They dream," the priest corrected. "The difference is ours, not theirs." He gestured toward the west. "The valley listens now. Every word we say crosses the sand twice, once for the living, once for the dead." Nebamun hesitated. "Then perhaps we should stop speaking?" The priest smiled, a tired, terrible smile. "You can stop words. You cannot stop meaning." That night, Thebes dreamed as one body. Every sleeper saw the same thing, a procession of figures moving through the desert, torches in hand, eyes hollow and bright. The torches were not fire, but gold, molten and slow, dripping into the sand. Each drop hissed and vanished, leaving behind a single hieroglyph, the sign for return. When morning came, the symbol appeared everywhere, carved on door lintels, scratched in bread crusts, traced in ash on the altars. No one admitted to making them. The priests washed the marks away with holy water, but they bled back through, darker, as if the city's walls were learning to write.
On the 5th day, the river turned black. Not thick or foul, just perfectly opaque, reflecting nothing. Birds flew low and skimmed its surface, but did not land. Fishermen found their nets empty and their hooks melting to dust. The vizier ordered a cleansing ritual, but the priests refused to bless the water. "It is not unclean," they said. "It is occupied." Nebamun's child fell ill that same night. The boy's fever burned without heat. His eyes stayed open, watching something no one else could see. He spoke in slow, careful syllables, as if repeating what someone whispered from behind the wall. "They're coming home," he said. "They're tired of being stories." Nebamun wept. His wife covered the boy's mouth with a cloth soaked in lotus oil and whispered prayers that sounded like apologies. The boy smiled. "You're praying to the wrong side," he murmured, and fell still. He did not die, but neither did he wake. The city turned on itself. The poor blamed the priests blamed the tomb robbers. The vizier blamed the high priest for moving the kings. The high priest blamed himself, which is the most dangerous blame of all. In a last act of penance, he led a final procession across the river. They carried no idols, no offerings, only lamps, one for each name they had disturbed. They climbed into the valley by night and disappeared into its throat.
From the city, people watched their lights dwindle like stars sinking into dawn. At sunrise, only one torch remained, flickering against the cliffs. Then it too went out. Weeks passed. Thebes emptied, not from conquest, but from fatigue. Those who remained learned not to ask questions about shadows. Children grew without learning the old hymns. The priests who survived became farmers. The vizier died standing, his hands still pressed to the table, where Nebamun's ledger lay open to a blank page. Nebamun himself kept writing. He wrote until ink ran out, and then continued with dust and oil, scratching lines into the walls of his home. The dead are patient. The living are merely guests. When the last of his lamps went out, he set down his reed and whispered into the dark, "I am done." A voice answered, gentle, almost kind. "No, Nebamun, not yet."
Centuries would pass before the sands covered Thebes. The temples would fall. The river would find new roots. The names of gods would change their accents. But sometimes, when the wind moved across the valley, it would carry a sound not quite like sand, not quite like song. Something between breathing and writing. The desert still listens. It always has. And somewhere beneath, the kings keep turning in their beds, dreaming of the day when the living forget how to fear them. When the floodwaters were treated, the Nile left behind a film of black silt over the streets of Thebes. It looked like a gift, but it was a burial shroud. Nothing grew in that soil. The farmers who tried said their seeds sprouted, then bent their stems toward the west and died, their roots clean as bone. The city tried to forget. It filled its ears with trade and gossip, its stomachs with whatever could still be coaxed from storage jars. But memory is a stronger harvest than grain. Each time the wind rose, it carried the sound of linen brushing stone, a whisper like pages turning in a book no one wanted to read again. Nebamun kept his house shuttered, the lamps always lit. His child still slept, chest rising and falling too shallowly, mouth moving in dream words that belonged to older tongues. Sometimes Nebamun thought he saw shadows crossing the boy's face, thin as reeds, as though someone stood just beyond the wall, breathing in time with him. The vizier's messengers stopped coming. The palace doors, once polished bright as beetle shells, hung crooked in their hinges. The guards that remained refused to stand near the western walls, claiming they heard music from beneath the foundations, soft flutes played underwater. The priests had vanished into the valley and had not returned. Rumor said they were still there, not as bones, but as keepers, their mouths sealed with resin, their eyes painted open to watch eternity inch closer. In the heat of midsummer, the air began to taste metallic. At dawn, the first red mist appeared, thin at first, like a veil of sand dust. By noon, it thickened until even the sun lost its edge, glowing dull and swollen, a wound behind gauze. The people called it the breath of the tombs. Children fainted. Goats bleated until their throats tore. The dogs disappeared entirely. Nebamun felt the taste of copper on his tongue as he tried to write, but every line blurred. His ink turned brown, then red, then black again, like something alive, reconsidering its color.
That night, the walls began to breathe. The plaster of his home expanded with every exhale, contracting with a slow rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He pressed his ear against it and heard the unmistakable murmur of voices, overlapping, reciting something too vast to follow. His son stirred in his sleep and whispered, "They're learning to talk like us." When dawn came, the sun refused to rise above the eastern hills. It hung there, a dull disk, uncertain whether it was morning or memory. A crowd gathered at the riverbank. The water had gone still, glassy, reflecting not the sky, but the cliffs of the necropolis. As they watched, a ripple spread across the surface, from the west toward the east, slow, steady, deliberate. Thebes went silent, even the insects hushed. And then, through the reflection, they saw them, faces beneath the water. Not corpses, not ghosts. Faces calm and patient, drifting upward as if testing how long the river could carry a secret. The vizier himself waded into the shallows, hands raised. "Show yourselves!" he cried. The water responded with a single bubble that rose to the surface and popped. The mist lifted for a heartbeat, revealing shapes on the opposite bank. Wrapped figures standing in rows, their linen shining faintly under the half-light. When the wind turned, the smell reached them. Resin, myrrh, and something sweetly decayed. The vizier fell to his knees, laughing until the laugh cracked into sobbing. That evening, Thebes began to empty. Families fled south toward the desert fortresses, carrying children, goats, and the last of the temple bread. Others refused to leave. They were born between gods and graves, they said. There's nowhere else to go. Nebamun stayed. His wife wanted to leave, but their son could not be moved. The boy's eyes opened now, but they no longer saw this world. He stared toward the west, lips dry, whispering what sounded like numbers. Count of the dead, Nebamun realized one night. He's reciting the census of the tombs. The realization hollowed him. He began writing down the words, desperate to find a pattern. On the fifth night, his reed pen stopped halfway through a line. The ink thickened, crawling up the shaft. He dropped it, and it wriggled on the table like a worm. He didn't try to pick it up again.
Commonecher's nephew came to him in dreams, barefoot, carrying a jar. Inside it, light pulsed softly, as though alive. "You said the desert listens," the boy said. "Now it's answering." When Nebamun woke, the jar was on his doorstep. The light within shifted, forming shapes, hieroglyphs written in fire. He recognized them. Not done. He took the jar to the river and hurled it in. It didn't sink. It drifted toward the cliffs. The water hissed where it touched. He stood watching long after the glow had faded, until he realized the river was no longer moving forward. The current had reversed. The Nile was flowing backward. In the days that followed, Thebes trembled. Walls split without sound. Columns leaned as though listening. The air shimmered with heat, but the sky was cool and gray. The western hills shuddered and cracked open like eggshells. From their wounds came dust, not ordinary dust, but gold. It fell over the city, soft as snow. Those who stepped outside came back glittering, eyes wide, breath shallow. By night, the city glowed faintly, as if lit from within. Nebamun sat beside his child and whispered, "Is this the end?" The boy smiled weakly. "No," he said, "it's the remembering."
On the 7th night of the gold dust, the kings walked. They came silently, wrapped in linen that moved like smoke. Their eyes were stones, but they gleamed faintly as they passed. They did not touch anyone. They did not speak. They simply walked the streets of their city as if testing whether it still fit them. Nebamun watched from his doorway. One of the figures paused in front of him. The linen across its face was torn, just enough to show a mouth shaped in a faint smile, the same chip he had once written about. The mask's laugh. The king inclined his head, not in greeting, but acknowledgement. Then he turned and continued west. When morning came, Thebes was silent. Those who survived found no footprints in the sand, only faint impressions where gold dust had melted into glass. Days turned to weeks. The river cleared. The sun climbed again. The air smelled like rain for the first time in years. Thebes did not rebuild. It merely persisted. The scribes who remained sealed Nebamun's last records in a clay jar and buried them under his house. They said it was to preserve history, but they knew better. It was to bury the memory before it woke again.
And beneath the cliffs, deeper than any tomb ever dug, something exhaled, soft, satisfied, endless. Thebes had remembered. The kings were home, and the desert, patient as always, began to write their story back into silence. No one truly knew when Thebes died. Some said it was the morning the river began to flow backward. Others said it was when the priests stopped speaking Amun's name aloud. But the desert knew. The desert always knows. It wrote the date in a language of wind and salt and silence that no living tongue could read. The city still stood. Its columns, pale and cracked, pointed at a sky that had forgotten to answer. The statues kept their vigil, faces eroded into soft, uncertain smiles, their eyes filled with the silt of centuries. The streets remained, carved into memory, though no one walked them by day. By night, however, oh, the night still belonged to the living and the almost dead. Nebamun's home was empty now. His wife had taken their son south with the last caravan, though he suspected the child's body had never woken on that journey. Sometimes he could still hear the boy's whisper from the walls, counting softly. The air in the house was thick with numbers. He no longer kept lamps. The dark was easier. When you lived in Thebes long enough, you learned that darkness was less a thing to fear than a thing that waited politely to be acknowledged. He spent his days walking between temple ruins, recording what had not yet fallen. His reed pen scratched symbols on sheets of beaten palm, lists of offerings that would never be made, names of gods whose mouths it closed. He wrote because it was the only thing he had left to give. He wrote because it felt like breathing. At sunset, when the wind changed and the air grew red, he heard the dead whisper again, always from the west, always soft, always near. We are still here. The vizier's palace was a ruin of echoing halls. Nebamun visited once, perhaps out of habit. The doorways yawned like open throats. The vizier himself was gone, though his chair remained, half buried in dust. Behind it, a single handprint glowed faintly on the wall, burned into the limestone as if pressed there by someone who had touched fire and decided not to let go. Nebamun touched the print. The stone was warm. He left the palace without writing a word.
The high priest had not returned from the valley, but his voice did. One night it filled the city, not as sound, but as vibration, a low hum that pulsed through the air, through the stone, through bone itself. It was a tone older than grief, older even than hope. Every door in Thebes opened. The sick sat up in their beds. The old smiled in their sleep. And in the market square, where no one had traded for months, every amulet and charm began to tremble on the ground, humming in answer. Nebamun fell to his knees. He could not cover his ears. There was no point. The sound was not something one heard, but something one was. When it stopped, the silence that followed was worse. For in that stillness came the whisper, "You forgot us." In the following days, Thebes moved like a city dreaming of itself. Doors opened to reveal rooms that hadn't existed before. Chambers lined with mirrors of polished bronze, reflecting faces that weren't there. Water seeped from cracks in the stone, though the river lay dry. The sands at the city's edge rippled inward, as if the desert were crawling home. High-Amneter's old stall reappeared, intact, under a canopy of faded linen. On the mat sat the fused relics he'd once carried to the river. Only now they'd cooled into new shapes. A single amulet the size of a man's heart, pulsing faintly beneath a crust of gold dust. Nebamun found it while walking at dawn. The amulet's glow reflected in his eyes like dawn seeing through water. He picked it up carefully, feeling warmth spread through his palm. It was beating, not a rhythm of life, but of memory, steady, deliberate, endless. He heard a voice inside his skull, "Scribe of the living, record the debt." He dropped the amulet. It rolled across the dirt, leaving a trail like smoke. That night he dreamed of the kings again, not as mummies, but as men. Tall, stern, eyes rimmed in kohl, their crowns dimmed but still dignified. They stood in the great hall of Karnak, surrounded by flame. "Why have you returned?" he asked them. "We never left," they said in one voice. "You pulled us back with ink and tongue. You measured our names. You breathed our breath into paper. You called us to balance the scale." "But I meant no harm."
The tallest among them stepped forward, his smile familiar, the chip in the lip, the faint crack of amusement that had haunted Nebamun since the night the mask surfaced. "You meant to preserve," he said, "and preservation is the kindest form of imprisonment." The torches flared, filling the air with gold dust. The kings turned, walking toward a doorway of light that looked like sunrise, except it was setting. When Nebamun tried to follow, the tallest king stopped him with one word, "Not yet." He woke, gasping, his hands covered in dried ink. The papyrus before him bore lines he did not remember writing. "When the river reverses again, so too will time. When the dust turns to glass, the dead will find reflection. When the scribe forgets his name, the story will rest." He traced the last line with his fingertip. The ink shimmered briefly, then faded into the fibers, vanishing completely. Nebamun closed his eyes and whispered, "Then I must forget." By now, the sand had begun to swallow the streets. Every night, dunes crept closer, filling alleyways, burying doorways, rising to the shoulders of statues. People stopped sweeping their thresholds. It seemed easier to let the desert finish its work. But the sand did not only cover, it revealed. As it shifted, it uncovered long-lost carvings, frescoes of faces and prayers older than the city itself. Each one depicted the same scene, a line of men carrying a coffin across the desert, followed by another line of men carrying nothing, their arms outstretched to the same rhythm. "The procession of the unfinished dead," Nebamun murmured, "the ones who never reached their tombs." He traced one carving and found his own name beneath it. That night, Thebes spoke. The sand lifted in great curls, forming shapes,
Arms, faces, mouths opening and closing without sound. The entire city exhaled. The dust on the ground rose, swirling into spirals that stretched toward the sky. From the cliffs, a light emerged, a soft golden glow like molten dawn spilling from cracks in the rock. It spread across the valley, crawling down the paths the priests had once walked. The air smelled of resin and myrrh and wet earth. The kings were returning, not as men, nor as ghosts, but as memory made visible. Nebamun stood at the temple gates as the glow reached the river. "You are home. What more do you want?" he whispered. The light slowed, then, like a voice through smoke, came the reply: "To be remembered by silence." And then the light sank, folding itself into the ground, into the walls, into the air itself.
When morning came, the city was gone. Only sand, smooth as parchment. Only wind, whispering over what had once been streets. Only a faint shimmer, like the last breath of a story ending mid-sentence. Somewhere beneath that silence, under layers of dust and gold and bone, Nebamun's last line remained carved into stone. Thebes slept beneath itself. The kings no longer stirred. The scribe lay down his pen, and the desert began to dream. The wind read it for 1,000 years, carrying it over the dunes until all the other words in the world forgot how to answer. And that is how the city of Thebes ended. Not in fire, not in conquest, but in memory so heavy it sank. The desert kept the rest. The sands had swallowed Thebes. The city was now nothing more than a mirage the desert repeated to itself, an echo of sunlit walls and shadowed columns shimmering on the horizon before dissolving into heat. The Nile had learned patience, winding past the ruins like a creature that knows how to keep secrets. But the desert is not a grave, it is a library, and beneath its silence, something had begun to stir once more. It began with the breathing. Not human, not animal, something deeper. The wind that had once swept harmlessly through the western cliffs now rose and fell with a rhythm like lungs filling and emptying. Travelers who dared cross the necropolis said the dunes shifted on their own, pulsing faintly underfoot, as if sand remembered how it used to be skin. Far below, where kings had slept and priests had sealed their work with trembling hands, air moved again for the first time in centuries. The cache that once held the pharaohs, the secret vault carved into the ribs of the mountain, had cracked open. Not with violence, but with exhaustion. The plaster seams, baked brittle by years of sun and silence, sighed and split. In the darkness, gold leaf glimmered faintly. Linen rustled like reeds in a wind that did not belong here. Then, slowly, one of the painted lids, Ramesses or perhaps Seti, it no longer mattered, shifted, releasing a thread of smoke that coiled upward and hesitated. The smoke found the ceiling, lingered, and then pressed through stone. In the world above, the wind carried that same thin smoke into the hollow of what had once been a city gate. It moved through the ruins like a curious spirit, brushing the bones of columns, tasting the forgotten incense clinging to temple walls. And then it found Nebamun, or what remained of him. He sat at the edge of what used to be the court of justice, wrapped in gray cloth, his reed pen clutched in fingers turned brittle as papyrus. The years had not taken him, only changed his shape. Dust had collected in his hair. His eyes were closed, but he was not quite gone.
When the smoke reached him, it curled around his shoulders and whispered like a pen across parchment. "Scribe, your record is unfinished." Nebamun's head tilted. The wind stirred the ash around his feet. His mouth opened, dry as limestone. "I wrote until the ink turned to dust," he murmured. "There is nothing left to say." "Then write in dust," said the voice. "The desert will read it." That night storms rose across the valley. Not storms of rain or thunder, but of sand, a tempest made of whispers. The dunes roared, and from their folds came fragments of voices, the high priest's low chants, Chimenedger's bargaining laughter, the cries of thieves who thought they could rob eternity. In the half-light between lightning and dawn, the city seemed alive again. Columns gleamed with the illusion of paint. Statues blinked as if returning from long thought. Thebes, for the space of a breath, remembered how to stand upright. But the memory was painful. The dead have no tolerance for nostalgia. As dawn bled into gold, the illusion faded, and all that remained was the dust, the thin, glittering veil of centuries falling once again over the stones. Far to the north, a caravan passed along the ruined edge of the river. Traders from Nubia, unaware of what they disturbed, camped near the buried temples. As they slept, one man heard singing. He thought it was his companions dreaming, but the song came from beneath the ground, soft, rhythmic, sung in a tongue older than empire. He followed it to the foot of a half-buried colossus. The song stopped when he knelt, and in its place came a voice like wind through reeds. "Tell them we are not gone. Tell them we are only waiting for the next hand to write." When he rose, the sand had already covered his footprints. He left without telling the others. Centuries drifted by like smoke through an empty hall. Thebes became a rumor told by shepherds. The kings who had once walked its streets turned to stories traded at campfires. But stories are a kind of currency the dead understand.
In a distant age, when foreigners came with shovels and torches, they followed those stories into the sand. They uncovered the sealed doors, brushed away dust that had forgotten it was sacred, and read aloud the names that had been meant only for the gods. When they lifted the first mask, the air moved again. The faintest sigh, the echo of that same breathing. Their lamps flickered, and for a heartbeat, every man among them heard it. Not done. Beneath the valley, Nebamun stirred. He opened his eyes for the first time in 1,000 years, and in the darkness of his tomb he saw a light, small, foreign, trembling with curiosity. He smiled, not in joy, but in recognition. "They've come to finish my record," he whispered. He reached for his pen. The reed was gone, but his finger traced lines in the dust on the wall, marking words only the desert could read. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the sound of his scratching up through the cracks and into the night. The explorers would later say the wind howled strangely that evening, as if the earth itself were writing. When morning came, the valley was quiet again. The diggers found new corridors, new treasures, new inscriptions. They found the scribe's name carved into stone, Nebamun, still legible, though it should have eroded centuries ago. They would argue for years about what the final line meant, for it was written not in Egyptian, but in something closer to a sigh. All memory becomes dust, and all dust becomes story. They did not understand that it was not an epitaph. It was an invitation.
That night the wind blew east, carrying gold dust toward the river once more. And if you stood in the right place, just where the cliffs begin to breathe, you could hear it whisper through the sand, "Right, we are listening." Thebes was gone. Thebes was awake. And the desert, patient as ever, had turned the end of history into its favorite story to tell.
The sand had become a sea without waves, and beneath it, Thebes slept. But even in sleep, cities dream, and sometimes dreams demand witnesses. One night, long after the first explorers had taken their trophies north and the desert had closed its mouth again, a tremor passed through the valley. A slow, low groan like breath through a sealed door. The dunes shifted as though something beneath them had turned over. For those few who still camped near the ruins, nomads, traders, madmen, it began with light. A thin blue glow seeped through the cracks of the rock, winding between the tombs, flowing like water that remembered how to move. It crawled across the sand, pausing at the places where names had been chiseled away. Wherever it lingered, the stones sighed, and the erased names returned, bright, brief, unbearable. The desert was speaking again. Nebamun's name was among them. He felt it before he heard it. In the silence of his half-existence, somewhere between memory and oblivion, the word Scribe rippled through the sand, tugging at the dust that had once been his fingers. He opened his eyes, or what passed for them, and found himself in a half-formed hall. The walls flickered like reflection in water. Figures stood all around him, translucent and tall, their faces still gilded by old prayers. They were the kings of Thebes, the hollow monarchs, the owners of eternity. Ramesses, Seti, Thutmose. Their names flared and faded in his mind like old candles. He knew them by posture, not by title. Power has its own scent. It smells like cedar and fear. "You called us," said one. The voice was calm, but the air cracked with its weight. Nebamun fell to his knees. "I recorded what I saw. I preserved your deeds." "You preserved our confinement," said another. "You bound our names to your paper. You made the living remember only half of us. You gave us memory, but no breath. I gave you immortality. You gave us silence that thinks too much. You gave us waiting," said the first voice. Their words were not sound, but vibration, humming through the space where his chest should have been.
The tallest king stepped forward, the one with the laugh in his mouth, the cracked lip of gold. He looked at Nebamun with the weariness of a god who has already forgiven too many. "We do not seek punishment," he said. "We seek completion." Nebamun bowed lower. "What remains undone?" The king's eyes flickered toward the desert above them. The city, the names, the story, the last witness. "You mean me." "You mean you," the king corrected, "and what came after you. The ones who will dig, the ones who will speak our names again without permission. They must know that the tomb does not end where the door closes." "I can warn them. I can write." The king smiled faintly. "Then write with what you are." And with that, he pressed his palm to Nebamun's chest. The scribe felt something tear, soundlessly, mercifully, and then spread outward like light. Above, In the ruins of Thebes, the storm began. Sand rose in columns, spinning upward as if pulled by invisible cords. The dunes swirled, reshaping themselves into fleeting outlines of buildings, colonnades, pylons, streets, stairs. For a heartbeat, the city stood again, its full silhouette painted in gold dust and wind. And in its heart, a figure appeared, kneeling before a glowing fissure in the earth. It was Nebamun, reborn in the form of dust and light, his features only half defined. He lifted his hands, and the air itself began to write. Across the valley walls, new inscriptions carved themselves into being, lines of glowing script, hieroglyphics the color of embers. They moved in patterns too complex for the human eye to follow, but the desert understood. Each symbol was a confession, each line a bridge between what had been and what refused to die. Far to the east, at the river's bend, a group of foreign excavators, Europeans, carrying notebooks and arrogance, saw the glow and thought it lightning. They climbed the ridge and froze when they saw the writing appear by itself. One of them, the youngest, whispered, "It's the breath of the dead." Another, older, laughed nervously, "It's heat lightning in the limestone." But even as he said it, his lamp flickered. The sand beneath his feet began to hum. The hum turned into a pulse, and when he looked down, he saw his own reflection in the sand, except the reflection was smiling back.
The king spoke through the earth. Every inscription Nebamun etched with his spectral hands was a verse in their requiem. The priest's broken chants, the robbers' confessions, the cries of famine, the whispers of the dead, all wove together into a single sound. And for a brief, blinding instant, Thebes sang. It was not a song of mourning. It was the song of return. The explorers covered their ears. One dropped to his knees, muttering prayers from a god that had never heard Egypt's tongue. The wind carried his words away like offerings refused. When the light finally faded, they were alone again. The valley lay still. The inscriptions had vanished, leaving behind only faint scorch marks in the stone. One of them found a tablet near the fissure, a broken slab bearing the last of Nebamun's words. They were not in hieroglyphs, but in smooth, curling letters that no one recognized. He traced them with his finger, and when he looked up, he swore the valley walls had shifted slightly closer. The team fled before dawn. Nebamun watched them go, his form thinning with the light. Around him the kings faded one by one, their gold turning to ash, their eyes closing at last. "You've done enough," said the one with the cracked smile. "Rest." Nebamun nodded. "And you?" The king looked toward the horizon, where dawn spilled like ink across sand. "We are dust. Dust never rests. It only waits for wind." He raised a hand in farewell, and the world fell silent. When the sun finally faded, there was no sign of the storm, only smooth sand, the faintest trace of carved letters half buried and half erased. But if you pressed your ear to the ground, you could still hear it, the soft rhythm of breath moving beneath the earth. The hollow kings were dreaming again. And in their dreams, the story of Thebes continued, written not in ink or stone, but in the echo of the desert's endless, patient sigh.
The sun over Thebes no longer burned. It watched. A pale, indifferent eye suspended in a sky rubbed thin by centuries of wind. The city was dust again, yet dust remembers form, and in the trembling light of dawn, the dunes looked almost like streets. There were no priests left, no viziers, no slaves or masons. Only the bones of columns and the bones of kings, one set above ground, the other below, both whispering the same word through the sand, again. Thebes had died many deaths, and each time something had learned how to rise. The tombs below were restless. Deep in the cliffs the air stirred in corridors sealed by gods and greed alike. There, among the painted eyes and cracked gold, the mummified kings began to murmur, not in language, not even in sound. It was the murmur of linen shifting on stone, of thought moving without lips. Ramesses dreamed of his armies marching through sand that had no end. Seti dreamed of rivers flowing backward through time. Thutmose dreamed of ink and parchment, of words that refused to stay still. And somewhere between them, Nebamun dreamed with them. The scribe had become part of the tomb, his body gone, his words etched into the very walls. He was the pulse that moved through the stone. When the explorers disturbed the valley, it was his breath they had heard rising through the cracks. He no longer feared the dead. He feared their silence. One night, or perhaps one century, Nebamun awoke inside a dream of his own making. He stood once more in the court of judgment, though it was not the hall of Osiris. It was Thebes itself, rebuilt in black glass, reflecting stars that had long since died. Every building shimmered, transparent as though the city had been carved from smoke. In the center, the thrones of the dead kings waited, each carved from obsidian, each empty. Then, one by one, the kings took their seats. Their linen wrappings fell away, revealing faces both human and divine, their eyes glimmering with that cold, familiar gold.
"Why have you called us?" asked the king with the broken lip, his voice carrying the calm of eternity. Nebamun bowed. "I did not call. I recorded. You called yourselves." "Words are doors," the king replied. "You built too many." "Then tell me how to close them." The king's smile deepened into something almost kind. "Doors close when there are no longer ears to hear." Nebamun frowned. "And what of those who will come? The new scribes, the seekers of gold, the children of dust?" "They will open them again," said Seti, his eyes black pools that swallowed stars. "Every age believes it has found the truth. Every age unseals us to prove it." The ground beneath Nebamun's feet began to tremble. He looked down and saw hieroglyphics crawling up from the earth, his own handwriting burning faintly blue. Each symbol rose like smoke, swirling around him until the air thickened with words. Then, with a sound like tearing cloth, the words burst outward. He saw flashes of time, empires rising, crumbling, the river changing course, the desert swallowing itself. Men in wide-brimmed hats digging into sacred ground. The cycle never stopped. The story always rewrote itself. When the vision faded, Nebamun was alone again. Only the cracked-throated wind answered him. He knelt on the glass floor of Dream Thebes and whispered, "Then let me be the last door." The kings did not move,
but their gaze sharpened. "Will you trade eternity for silence?" Nebamun smiled sadly. "Eternity is the longest way to say unfinished." The air shivered. Something ancient and vast exhaled through the stone. Above ground, the dunes shifted once more. From the heart of the valley came a deep, slow sound, the grinding of stone on stone. A fissure split the earth, revealing a black passage that breathed heat and shadow.
The desert travelers nearby froze. One of them, an old Bedouin with more scars than teeth, whispered, "The kings are talking again." From the crack, a faint blue light spilled out, coiling into the night like incense smoke. It drifted over the dunes, carrying with it words none could understand. But one phrase repeated itself, clear and terrible. "Do not write our names." In the darkness below, Nebamun walked the length of his last tomb. The walls around him pulsed with slow golden veins, as though the stone itself had learned to breathe. He carried no pen. His hand traced the air, leaving behind letters made of dust and light. He wrote not for gods, nor kings, nor even for history. He wrote for the desert, for the silence that would come when the last mouth forgot how to speak his language. When he finished, the letters faded, sinking into the walls like water into sand. The tomb grew still. Nebamun lay down beside the sleeping kings and closed his eyes. The walls whispered around him, repeating his final sentence until it became prayer. Every word is a resurrection, and every silence a burial. The desert sighed, covering him again, layer upon layer. Centuries later, a wandering scholar found a shard of limestone half buried near Luxor. On it were words that glowed faintly in the dusk. He traced them with reverence, mouthing their meaning. When he turned the shard over, the light had already gone out. He looked to the horizon, where the cliffs of Thebes slept under their eternal veil, and thought he heard the faint rustle of parchment beneath the sand. The desert was still writing. And somewhere, far below, Nebamun's voice whispered through the stone, "So long as one remembers, the kings will not rest." The scholar fled, dropping the shard behind him. The sand closed over it without a sound. And in the quiet that followed, the hollow kings smiled. The desert was quiet again, too quiet. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from listening. The dunes around Thebes no longer moved with the wind. They held their shape, frozen as if waiting for a verdict. And yet, something beneath them stirred.
When the first wind came that morning, it did not come from the north or south, but from below. A breath that rose through the sand, tasting of copper, dust, and old perfume. It brushed the empty streets of the ruined city, slithered through the ribs of collapsed columns, and circled the shattered temples like a serpent rediscovering its nest. No birds called, no jackals cried. Thebes had remembered how to breathe again. Far below, the air trembled in the sealed vaults where kings slept in endless procession. The walls flickered as if some hidden fire moved beneath the painted scenes of gods and stars. Hieroglyphs shimmered, rearranging themselves when no eyes watched,
twisting from prayers into warnings. And at the heart of that silent palace of the dead, Nebamun stirred. He no longer had a body in any mortal sense, but his shape still clung to memory, a faint outline like ink long dried but unwilling to fade. He felt the tremor ripple through his resting place, a pulse that reminded him of writing, the rhythm of creation. But this was not his hand. Someone else was writing now. The desert itself. He could hear it in the vibrations of the sand above, the low hum of words forming in the wind, phrases repeated over and over by invisible tongues. We were not forgotten. We were only buried in sound. Above the valley, travelers returned. They were new men with old hunger, explorers, archaeologists, grave readers. They carried lamps, cameras, and maps etched with precision but no reverence. To them, Thebes was not a memory, it was an equation of glory and profit. The leader, a scholar named Dr. Thorne, believed he had found a hidden chamber beneath the known tombs. His guide had refused to enter. He warned, "The sand moves there. It listens when you speak." Thorne had laughed. "Then I'll whisper the truth to it." He led his men into the valley, their lanterns flickering like nervous eyes. The air grew heavy. The ground seemed to breathe under their boots. One of them, a young Egyptian worker named Hani, paused near a half-buried stele. Its carvings were faint, but the words glowed briefly when the light touched them. He knelt and read aloud without knowing why. "When the wind learns our names, it will speak them forever." The sound echoed across the valley, and the wind answered.
At first, it was only a whisper, a sigh through cracks in the cliff. Then, the sand began to rise, not in gusts, but in steady columns, like pillars being built by invisible hands. The air turned thick and electric. The explorers stumbled back, shielding their faces, but the sand did not fall. It gathered, coiling in spirals that formed human shapes. Dozens of them, hundreds, faces without detail, eyes hollow, mouths open in silent exhalation. Dr. Thorne raised his lantern and whispered, "My God." Hani grabbed his arm. "No," he said, voice trembling, "not yours." The nearest figure turned its head, the motion smooth and deliberate. The air around it shimmered with heat. Beneath its feet, the sand melted into glass. Then it spoke, not in English nor Egyptian, but in a sound older than either, a vibration that seemed to shake the world's bones. And every man in the valley understood the meaning. The breath returns to the mouth that stole it. In the darkness below, Nebamun felt the words tear through the rock. The kings were waking again. He could feel their resentment, their confusion, their endless longing for balance. He reached toward them, not with hands, but with will, and whispered, "Enough." The walls trembled. The gold leaf on the coffins flaked into dust. "Let them go," he pleaded. "Let the living write their own ending." A voice answered him, smooth, ancient, full of endless patience. "You wrote us into forever. You only can write us out." "I am only a scribe," he said. "Then write like a god." Above, the wind howled into form. The sand spirits bent toward the explorers surrounding them. Each one whispered a different name, a king, a queen, a forgotten craftsman. The sound was deafening, yet soft as silk. The men fell to their knees, clutching their ears. The lamps burst, spilling fire onto the dunes. The flames danced in impossible patterns, sketching the outline of temples and tombs that had not existed for millennia. And in the midst of it, Hani heard another voice,
Clearer, closer. It came from beneath the ground. It said, "Write this down." He grabbed his notebook, trembling. His hand moved on its own. He wrote symbols he had never seen, his pen guided by something else. When he finished, he read what he had written. "The dead have forgiven the silence, but not the sound." He looked up and saw a Nebamun standing before him, a figure made of smoke and dust, his eyes burning faintly like embers buried too long. "You can see me," Nebamun said, almost to himself. "Then it's not too late."
The kings rose behind him, their forms towering, their linen unraveling into banners of gold dust. The air filled with the scent of frankincense and iron. Nebamun turned to them. "End it. Let the sand rest." Ramesses, the one with the broken smile, tilted his head. "Endings are for men who forget their names." Nebamun's voice hardened. "Then remember mine. I wrote your names into eternity. Now let mine erase them." He stepped forward, pressing his palm to the air. Symbols exploded from his fingertips, bright, searing hieroglyphics that spun outward, burning through the storm. The sand convulsed, the light dimmed, and the whispering ceased. The wind stopped. The valley fell silent. For the first time in 1,000 years, Thebes slept without dreaming. When dawn came, the valley was smooth as glass. The explorers were gone. No bones, no tools, no footprints. Only Hani remained, his notebook clutched in his lifeless hands, his eyes open to the sunrise. On the first page, in unfamiliar handwriting, was a single line written after his death. "Silence is the last word of gods." The wind lifted the page, carried it across the dunes, and buried it beneath the sand where Nebamun once stood. And beneath it all, the scribe finally rested, not forgotten, not forgiven, but finished. The cursed wind of Thebes, for the first time, was only wind. The dawn after the storm came pale and soundless. The Valley of the Kings, once a battlefield of whispers and wind, now lay as smooth as a sheet of gold beaten flat. The sand gleamed faintly in the newborn light, unbroken except for a single ridge near the heart of the necropolis, a scar in the shape of a breath. For the first time in centuries, Thebes was truly still. But stillness, as the desert knows, is not the same as peace. The world had changed above. Empires had risen, burned, and forgotten their debts to the dead. Thebes was nothing more than a name on the maps of scholars and treasure seekers, a rumor pressed into textbooks. But the sand remembers better than men. Beneath it, the breath of the kings lingered. Their dreams had hardened into stone, waiting for something or someone to disturb them again. And so it happened that one night the desert breathed in. The dunes contracted as if exhaling, the air thickened, a low hum rose from the cliffs, too deep to be sound, too old to be fear. In the ruins of Karnak, a statue of Amun cracked from shoulder to crown, and from the fracture came a sigh. Thebes was waking, not as a city, but as a thought.
Far away, in a museum where the air smelled of oil and dust, a curator named Miriam El-Sayed walked through the Egyptian wing long after closing hours. The floor lights glowed weakly beneath glass cases filled with relics, scarabs, papyrus scraps, amulets carved with forgotten prayers. Her footsteps echoed softly.
She'd walked this path for 10 years, but tonight it felt different, too quiet, too intent. When she reached the far exhibit, the mummified hand of an unnamed scribe, she stopped. The tag below it read, "Recovered from the Valley of the Kings, 1904, possibly connected to the Nebamun fragments." She smiled faintly. "Nebamun," she whispered. "They still don't know if you ever existed." Something in the glass fogged. Her breath caught. No, there was no fog. The glass was breathing back. Miriam froze, staring. The air inside the case swirled faintly, like sand caught in a breeze. The mummified fingers twitched once, then went still. The lights above flickered, casting the whole gallery into brief darkness. Then on the inside of the glass, words appeared, slowly, as if written by a fingertip dragged through dust. "We are unfinished." The lights blinked back to life. The glass was clear again. Her heart hammered. She laughed nervously to herself, rubbing her arms. "You've been working too long, too much coffee, too many ghost stories." But when she turned to leave, she saw a trail of sand on the floor, fine golden, leading from the display toward the exit. And faintly, behind her, the sound of a pen scratching across parchment. That night, Miriam dreamed of the desert. She saw the Valley of the Kings from above, the dunes rippling like water, the tombs glowing faintly beneath the surface. And at the center, a figure knelt, his hands pressed to the sand. He looked up at her. His eyes were like stormlight trapped in glass. "Nebamun," she breathed. He nodded once. The wind carried his voice, dry and low. "Thebes sleeps in your hands now." When she woke, her sheets were full of sand. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen in the museum. The walls cracked along faultless, deliberate lines. The temperature in the Egyptian wing dropped 5 degrees. Complaints of hearing whispers when they stood near the old coffins. One child claimed the eyes painted on a sarcophagus had blinked. Miriam buried herself in work. She translated new hieroglyphic fragments discovered in the archives, inscriptions found in the valley during the early 1900s, but never fully translated. She froze when she reached the last line. "When the living forget their silence, the breath of stone will rise again." She stared at it for a long time. Outside, the wind began to howl, though no windows were open.
That night, the lights in the museum stayed on by themselves. Security footage later showed movement in the Egyptian hall. The curtains shifting, though the air was still, sand spilling from cracks in the walls, cases trembling as if something inside them were trying to breathe. At 2:37 a.m., Miriam appeared on the cameras, walking barefoot down the corridor, holding a notebook. She paused before Nebamun's display and whispered something to the glass. The audio caught only one word: enough. Then she opened her notebook, dipped her pen in nothing, and began to write on the floor. The ink glowed faintly gold. Each stroke of her pen sent ripples through the glass cases. The artifacts began to hum, the same deep tone that had once rolled through the cliffs of Thebes. When she finished the final line, the hum stopped. Every light in the building went out. Morning. The guards found her asleep at her desk. The floor of the gallery was covered in thin dust, smooth as parchment. All the artifacts were untouched, except for one, the scribe's hand, now gone. In its place, on the inside of the glass, someone had written in fresh ink, "The breath of stone has ended. Let silence be the keeper." Miriam never spoke of that night, but she left the museum the following week and disappeared into the desert,
taking nothing but her notebook. Months later, a pilot flying over the western cliffs of Luxor reported seeing something strange. A circle drawn into the sand, large enough to be seen from the air, and in its center, a single figure, kneeling, writing. When he returned the next morning, the circle was gone. Only the wind remained. Some say that on certain nights, when the desert grows too still, you can hear it. The faint scratch of a pen against stone, the whisper of words being buried beneath sand. Thebes does not haunt the living anymore. It records them. For silence, at last, has found its scribe. And somewhere, beneath the shifting dunes, Nebamun's final breath lingers, carried by the wind that built and buried Thebes, murmuring the truth the desert has always known.
The desert was not empty. It never had been. It only pretended, patiently, beautifully, to be forgotten. After Miriam vanished into the sands, Thebes fell silent once more. Scholars called her disappearance tragic, the cost of obsession. Her notebook, recovered years later, was nothing but blank pages. Yet when the paper was held to light, faint gold traces appeared, shapes that were not hieroglyphs, but something older, something that seems to breathe when watched too long. The museum sealed the book away, locked it behind glass, labeled it Artifact Unknown, and the desert began to move again. The winds returned, but they no longer sang. They whispered. They whispered names. Travelers across the western cliffs started reporting strange things, patterns etched overnight into the dunes, spirals that could only be seen from the air. One looked like a feather, another like an open eye. The locals refused to go near them. They said each pattern marked a breath that had escaped the earth. A merchant passing through at dusk claimed the sands sighed as they walked over them, as though some great lung below were slowly waking up. But it wasn't the kings. It was Thebes itself. The city had grown tired of being buried. In Cairo, a team of archaeologists gathered around a satellite image of the valley. Their leader, Dr. Malik Rahim, adjusted his glasses and frowned. He tapped the map and said, "This pattern is not natural. It matches no erosion model, no sand formation known to meteorology. Look here, the ratio, 5-to-1. It's deliberate." Someone laughed. "You're saying the sand is drawing?" Malik hesitated. "No, I'm saying something beneath it is writing." The room went silent. He didn't mention Miriam, but her name hovered between them all the same. That night, Malik dreamed of a voice. It came through the wind, through the grainy whisper of static in his sleeping ear. "You follow the wrong maps. You measure what you cannot contain." He woke to find his tent full of sand, fine, pale gold, forming letters across the floor. He bent close, brushing the surface gently. The message was written in English this time, as if the desert had been practicing. "Do not unbury silence." He blinked, and the words scattered. Days later, the expedition reached the valley. The sand was hot enough to blister through their boots. They followed their instruments toward the coordinates of the anomaly. The wind had carved a spiral there, so perfect it hurt to look at. The dunes sloped inward to a shallow bowl, at the center of which lay a slab of black stone. Its surface was smooth, but when Malik's assistant brushed it, dust rose in golden curls, forming words that were not quite carved, but remembered.
They read, "Here sleeps Nebamun, the final scribe. He wrote until the breath forgot its owner." The assistant stepped back. "This is impossible," she whispered. Malik didn't answer. His hands shook. "Get the scanner." But the scanner failed. The batteries drained instantly. The sun dimmed behind a sudden wall of cloud, and from the hollow wind came a faint sound, the unmistakable scratch of a reed pen against stone. Malik turned slowly. At the edge of the dune stood a figure. It was neither shadow nor mirage. Its shape was dust held together by memory, eyes glowing faintly like embers buried too deep to cool. Nebamun. He spoke softly, his voice the sound of parchment tearing. "You dig for gold. You think you seek knowledge, but you are only hunting silence to sell it." Malik's knees trembled. "We only want to understand." "Understanding is the first sin of the living," Nebamun said. "You break what you name." He stepped forward. Each footfall left a perfect impression in the sand, but no wind dared erase it. "I ended my story, and the desert began to dream, but you woke it again." "What are you?" Malik whispered. Nebamun smiled faintly. "The question that still has ink." The sand around them began to rise, curling into shapes, faces, hands. The faint outline of walls long vanished. Thebes was forming itself out of memory, its ghostly pillars glowing gold and white. Through the shimmer of heat and history, Malik could see the faint shape of a woman kneeling, writing. Miriam. She looked up at him, her expression both tender and sorrowful. "You shouldn't have come." He reached for her. "You're alive!" "Alive is the wrong word. I'm remembered. That's worse." Nebamun turned toward her. "You carried my breath when I could not. Now let it rest." Miriam nodded once. Her body dissolved into sand that rose on the wind and disappeared toward the cliffs.
Malik fell to his knees, tears stinging his eyes. "What do you want from us?" Nebamun's face softened. "What all stories want, to stop repeating." He lifted his hand, and the dunes trembled. A golden light spread across the valley, wrapping everything in its glow. The instruments melted into silence. The air smelled of lotus and smoke. Malik closed his eyes, hearing the whisper of voices, countless and calm. The breath returns to stone. When he opened them again, the valley was empty. His team was gone. The spiral had vanished. The slab of black stone was smooth and featureless, the words erased as though they had never existed. Years later, tourists would visit the valley again. They would walk where Thebes once stood, take photographs, and marvel at the silence. But sometimes, on windless nights, the sand shifts in strange patterns, circles, spirals, and the faint outline of a quill pressed into the earth. And if you listen closely, the dunes seem to murmur, not in anger, not in sorrow, but in warning. The desert keeps what it remembers. Because memory, like gold, never dies. It only waits for the next hand to dig. The desert does not forget. It delays. It holds its stories the way an old god holds a grudge, letting centuries pass like shallow breaths. And so, after Nebamun's light faded and Dr. Malik vanished into legend, the sands of Thebes waited, not for men, not for kings, for the next pen that dared to speak.
It came in the form of machines. Centuries later, the valley was a museum without walls, drones mapping dunes, satellites scanning shadows, tourists spilling from buses like dust in reverse. Scholars no longer carried lamps and papyrus. They carried sensors, lasers, and digital tablets that hummed quietly as they swallowed the landscape. They said they were preserving Thebes, recording it, but the desert recognized the old lie. A young archaeologist named Laila Sayed led one such expedition. She was born in Cairo, but had studied in London, raised on myths of curses and buried gods. Her thesis, The Semiotics of Silence, reconstructing lost Egyptian narratives, had made her famous before she'd ever seen sand that wasn't imported for film sets. When she arrived at the Valley of the Kings, she laughed. "It's so small. History is always smaller than we think." The wind did not laugh back.
Her team worked for weeks, mapping subterranean anomalies. On the 23rd day, one of their scanners returned something strange. A void, perfectly cubic, where the bedrock should have been solid. "An unrecorded chamber," said the technician. "It's impossible. No entrance, no structural fault. It's like a box carved from air." Lila smiled, exhilarated. "Then we've found the tomb of meaning itself." The team excavated carefully. Dust fell like old breath. Each meter they dug made the air colder. At last, the shovel struck something that wasn't stone, a surface smooth as glass, humming faintly when touched. They cleared it until it formed a perfect rectangle. Someone whispered, "A door." But it wasn't. It was a page. Black and seamless, with faint gold lines running through it like veins. When Lila brushed it with her fingertips, symbols flared across it. Hundreds, thousands, shifting and rearranging in golden light. Her assistant gasped, "It's writing itself!" Lila knelt, mesmerized. "No," she said, "it's remembering." That night, she dreamed of Nebamun. He stood by a river that flowed in both directions, his reflection a different man each time the current turned. "You came too late," he said softly. "The story already knows its ending." Lila tried to speak, but her words turned to sand in her mouth. "Don't write. Erase." She woke, choking, her tent full of wind and gold dust. The air shimmered. The black slab outside glowed faintly beneath the stars. At dawn, the team gathered to record the discovery. Their equipment malfunctioned again. Cameras refused to focus. Lenses cracked. Screens displayed lines of text none of them could read. The black page pulsed like a heartbeat. Lila approached it slowly. "This isn't stone," she murmured. "It's a record made by something that remembers differently than we do." The technician laughed nervously. "Like what?" "Like the desert," she said.
When she placed her hand against the page, it turned to liquid light. The symbols rippled outward in concentric rings. A soft hum filled the air, low, patient, familiar. The sound of breath under sand. The dunes began to move. Waves of golden dust rose around them, swallowing the camp. The wind took shape. Faces, hands, voices woven from centuries of memory. They spoke in overlapping tones, not angry, not kind, just endless. Unwritten words seek mouths. The black page brightened, and beneath Lila's feet, the earth gave way. She fell into the glow, weightless, soundless, into a corridor lined with shifting walls of script. Every word she had ever read floated there, glowing faintly. sacred texts, personal notes, the scrawled margins of her research. All of them blurred together into one moving river of thought. At the far end stood Nebamun. He looked as he had in her dream, ancient, weary, eyes filled with the calm of a man who has seen too many beginnings. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Lila stepped forward. "You called me." "I called silence. You answered." "What is this place?" "The unrecorded, where the desert stores what men were not wise enough to bury properly." She looked around, dizzy. "It's beautiful. It's unfinished." He held up a papyrus scroll that glowed faintly with her name written in ancient ink. "Every generation writes the same story. The living disturb, the dead respond, and then the living forget. Thebes is not a city. It's the loop of that forgetting." Lila shook her head. "Then break it." "I tried." His voice cracked like parchment. "You are the ink that returned." The corridor trembled. The words around them began to dissolve, shedding light like ash. The ceiling split open, revealing sky, a night sky that burned gold instead of black. Nebamun reached out, his hand a ripple of dust. "Erase me," he said, "before they begin again." Lila stared. "How?" He smiled faintly. "Don't write the truth. Forget it." The walls groaned. She felt the pressure of centuries, the weight of memory crushing inward. Taking a breath, she stepped forward and placed both hands on the scroll. "I forget," she whispered. The world exploded into light. When she woke, she was lying at the edge of the valley. Her team was gone. The dig site was buried under smooth, untouched dunes. The instruments, the tents, the black page, everything erased. Only her tablet remained beside her. On its screen was a single unsent email to herself. The subject line read, "The Night of the Unwritten." The body was empty. She closed the device, her reflection faint in the glass. Behind her, the wind sighed through the cliffs, gentle, almost human. Thebes had fallen silent again. But in the distance, somewhere deep beneath the sand, something shifted, soft as paper turning a page. The story wasn't over. It was only waiting to forget itself. The wind returned at dusk. It moved like memory, slow, deliberate, as though the air itself had stopped to read what it carried. The dunes glowed faintly beneath the dying light, each one shaped by centuries of breath and silence. And there, where Thebes had once stood, the desert began to write again. Layla Sayed walked barefoot across the sand, her shadow stretching long and thin behind her. The valley was silent now, too silent. Not even the insects dared to hum. Every few steps, she looked back, half expecting to see her team, her tents, her instruments. There was nothing. The sand remembered where they had been. She had forgotten their names. When she closed her eyes, she saw the corridor again, the unrecorded words flowing like rivers of gold, Nebamun's voice echoing through eternity. Don't write the truth. Forget it. But she couldn't. Memory had taken root in her. It whispered beneath her ribs, restless and alive. I can't forget, she murmured to the wind. I was made to remember. The wind answered with a sound that might have been laughter, or the scratching of a pen across stone. At the edge of the valley, she found something half buried in the sand. It wasn't metal or bone or stone. It was paper. Papyrus,
impossibly preserved, its edges sealed in a thin layer of gold dust. She brushed it clean and froze. On the page, words appeared, shifting, bright, alive. Her name, and beneath it another. Nebamun. The letters pulsed like a heartbeat. She whispered, "You're still here." The wind rose suddenly, whipping her hair into her face, flinging sand around her. The sky darkened in a single breath, as if something vast had leaned over the world to listen. The papyrus trembled in her hands, and the words changed. "We are not gone. We are the ink of time. We are the story that refuses to die." She fell to her knees, clutching the page as if it were alive. Around her, the dunes began to ripple outward, forming perfect circles, like the sound of her heartbeat drawn in sand.
A voice rose from the valley floor. It was soft, measured, and terribly familiar. "Do you know what you've done, Layla Sayed?" Nebamun's figure emerged from the dust, whole this time, almost human. The wind shaped him with care, filling his form with light instead of flesh. His eyes burned like two small suns beneath a veil of sand. "You broke the forgetting," he said. Layla stood, trembling. "I didn't want to bring you back. I wanted to understand." "That's how it always begins," he said. "Understanding is a kind of hunger. The more you feed it, the less of you remains." The wind surged around them, hot and electric. In the distance, dunes collapsed like lungs exhaling. From their depths rose shapes, figures made of dust and gold, faces half-formed, mouths open in silent recitation. The kings, the priests, the robbers, the scribes, all of Thebes was standing again, sculpted from air and remembrance. Layla stepped back. "What are they doing?" Nebamun's voice was almost kind. "They are waiting for you to finish the sentence." The papyrus in her hands glowed brighter, words rearranging themselves like living veins. "The desert keeps what it remembers." Beneath it, new lines appeared, lines she hadn't written, but recognized from somewhere inside her own mind. "When silence learns to speak, let the living listen. When the last pen breaks, the wind will write."
She stared at them until her vision blurred.
"It's writing itself."
Nebamun nodded slowly. "Because the story is tired of being told." The figures around them began to fade into streams of sand, their shapes dissolving, as if drawn backward into the breath that had made them. One by one, they collapsed into golden dust, spinning into the sky. Nebamun turned to her. "Thebes has remembered enough. Now it must rest." "And me?" "You must choose," he said, "to forget or to become the next page." Lila looked down at the papyrus. Its surface pulsed, beckoning. Her own reflection shimmered there, her face replaced by 1,000 others. Miriam's, Malek's, nameless explorers, faceless kings. Every one of them carried the same expression: wonder, fear, understanding too late. She took a breath. "What happens if I forget?" "The desert will close its mouth." "And if I remember?" Nebamun's smile was gentle, infinite. "Then you'll write until the wind knows your name." Lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating the valley for one last heartbeat.
Lila pressed her palm to the papyrus. The gold line spread up her arm, crawling over her skin like roots seeking a home. Her body glowed, her hair turned to dust, her eyes to light. Nebamun watched as she dissolved into the wind, her voice echoing faintly. "Every word is a resurrection." The papyrus fell to the ground, blank once more. Nebamun reached down, touched it lightly, and whispered, "Then rest, little scribe." He turned and walked into the storm, his shape unraveling into the horizon. The wind followed, carrying his name across the dunes one last time before silence closed over it all. At dawn, the desert was calm. Where the valley had been, only smooth glass sand remained, untouched, unbroken. A single line was etched into it, carved not by hand, but by wind. "The last scribe has written, the story sleeps." No one saw it. No one needed to. Because some stories are not meant to be remembered. They are meant to wait, breathing, dreaming, until the next fool with a pen mistakes silence for permission. And when that day comes, the wind will rise again, gentle and knowing, carrying with it the sigh of ancient Thebes. We are never finished.